1993. He also holds a degree in Catholic theology, has been invested in questions of faith and theology. He teaches metaphysics and philosophy of mind at the Munich School of Philosophy and St. Louis University, and has published quite widely on these topics. In particular, early on in the early 90s, he was one of the chief architects in the revival of panpsychism and analytic philosophy. And he's been an active advocate for Whitehead research in Germany and Europe. In particular, and this is an invitation to all of you, both online and in person, this year, 2023, in July 26th to 29th, we're having the 13th International Whitehead Conference held at the Munich School of Philosophy. And the theme there is going to be Whitehead and the history of philosophy. So we're going to have Dr. Maassen, Dr. Buntrump there, as well as a number of others, in a truly large event. So we hope that you'll join us there. So please welcome Dr. Buntrump as we enter Brains, Souls, and Self, Process and Identity.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and also a very warm invitation to come to Munich. The Munich School of Philosophy is right between the university and the English Garden City Park. It's in the middle of everywhere. It's really nice, and the summer in Bavaria is nice, so you couldn't be at a better place. So, and it's just one building. We have all the meetings in one building. You don't have to walk a lot and orient yourself. So it's going to be nice. It's my honor to welcome the first speaker, Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. He is a philosopher of mind. He's also a metaphysician. He specializes in Whitehead, Nietzsche, and Spinoza especially. And also, that's how we got to know each other, in panpsychism. He is a lecturer at the University of Exeter and published several books, Pneumonautics, and then is co-editor and contributor to the Bloomsbury Philosophy of Psychedelics. 2 years ago, 2 years ago, I taught a seminar on philosophy of mind and new psychedelic research, to which he contributed via Zoom and had very interesting things to say. And it's a very interesting new research field to use psychedelics again for therapeutic purposes. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, Peter.
Well, thank you, Gudehard, and thank you to the CPS. I'm honored and delighted to be here, and it's very nice to see some old friends and make some new ones. Right, so I normally talk about Whitehead at psychedelic conferences, but today it's the other way around. I'm talking about psychedelics to a Whitehead conference. So I'll mostly be giving you a context in which you might see how Whitehead's metaphysics can be applied in a practical sense, both in terms of therapy and beyond that, in terms of societal enrichment. It's a conjecture, but bear with me. So I've called this process psychonautics, Whitehead and psychedelic research. Psychonaut means someone who explores the mind, coined by Ernst Jünger, a German philosopher. So my plan is this. I will first of all give you a little bit of history about psychedelic research and therapy, and also then talk about what we're doing today. It's an emerging field, psychedelic research, and it's very exciting, I think. Secondly, I'll talk about psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences, which are, overlap with mystical experiences. I'll make the differentiation. I realize I only have 20 minutes. Thirdly, integration. I'll talk about the integration phase of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I'll explain all these terms as we go along. And lastly, I'll give you hints as to how one might apply Whitehead's thought in psychedelic therapy, especially in terms of his 3 Ps: prehension, panexperientialism, and panentheism. Okay, so let's quickly give you an outline of psychedelic research. I'm just giving you the Western century, really, but of course, psychedelics have been used in terms of therapy and also other uses going back thousands of years, especially here in the Americas. Peyote, San Pedro, and so on have been used, but that's another talk. So let's zoom into the 20th century. So in 1902, William James published The Varieties of Religious Experience. Of course, Whitehead was much inspired by William James. And in this book, William James is one of the first really to link mystical experiences with those experiences induced by psychoactive drugs. He wasn't the first. A guy called Benjamin Paul Blood actually wrote to William James with his philosophy of nitrous oxide and metaphysics. But William James wrote about it in a very elegant manner and made it a real topic of interest at the start of the 20th century. There was a flurry of literature about this, stemming therefrom. And I should say this was about drug-induced drug-induced mystical experience, but it wasn't at that time illegal, of course. There was that flurry of activity based on James's work, and I should say, even today, William James really is the bedrock of this field. 1938, Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist, synthesized LSD and took it in 1943. He took a huge amount because he was the first one to ever take it, and he didn't really know what was considered standard. And he rode a bicycle back home that day, followed by a demon. Wasn't particularly pleasant, but afterwards it became a very pleasant experience for him. And then later on in life, he got into the philosophy of the experience with Ernst Junger, the German philosopher I mentioned. Wrote a book called LSD, My Problem Child in 1979, which has got the last chapters got some interesting pantheistic philosophy in it. 1953, CIA get involved and wonder how psychedelics can be used for mind control in their project called MK Ultra. Sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's well documented. 1954, Aldous Huxley publishes The Doors of Perception, which was culturally influential about his experiences on mescaline. Therein, he tries to explain it using Bergson's thought via C.D. Broad, but it doesn't really deeply go into it. 1957, Huxley's friend Humphrey Osmond coined the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, and in that paper, he references William James, and he says, even though he was a psychiatrist, he emphasizes the philosophical importance of these mind manifesting drugs. And there was some philosophical interest, and they Osmond Huxley almost organized this conference called Outside in the 50s, where they were going to bring 50 of the world's leading intellectuals. They invited Einstein, Jung, many others to take mescaline and then write about it. Unfortunately, it didn't get the funding in the last minute from the Ford Foundation, so it's the greatest thing that never happened in psychedelia. And then go forward 10 years, Timothy Leary gets expelled from Harvard for giving LSD and psilocybin to his students. It was sort of frowned upon. And a year after that, UK military tested LSD for combat as a combat incapacitant, but it was too unpredictable to use for combat, so it was sort of neglected. And then, you had various laws. LSD went into Western culture like a hand grenade, really, caused havoc. The authorities didn't know what to do, so it was eventually sort of outlawed in 1971 with the UN following Nixon's war on drugs. It wasn't that prohibition was not really based on scientific evidence or reason. It was a political decision, but that's again another talk. And then, okay, I've missed out the 90s here. I should say in the 1990s, certain people got licenses to use psychedelics. Rick Strassman especially, he tested DMT, the psychedelic drug DMT, to find the neural correlates thereof. It wasn't in terms of therapy. But one thing I've missed is in the 1950s and to the 70s, LSD was used as an agent within therapy. So in Europe, you had psycholytic therapy, which was small doses of psychedelics, LSD mostly, which was used as a tool for psychoanalysis mostly. And in parallel, in the US, in California especially here, you had psychedelic peak therapy where large doses were administered. And that was quite successful. But nonetheless, because it got into the public and because of sensationalism in the media, nonetheless it was prohibited. Anyways, in the 90s, a few licenses were given, and then about 10 years ago, we entered the so-called psychedelic renaissance, and we're in it now, which involves, well, for the last 10 years, there have been numerous trials showing that psychedelics can be actually beneficial. They don't melt your brain. They can actually be, on the contrary, quite beneficial against ailments such as PTSD, depression, fear, anxiety, OCD, so on and so forth. And so this is a new field of research, still early days, again, in a way. We don't use Freud anymore, as they did in the sort of mid-20th century. But so my whole spiel today, really, is to show that that it seems that the most effective therapeutic use of psychedelics is when they induce what I will call metaphysical experiences. And at the moment, it's psychiatrists and psychologists who are administering these drugs, but of course they're not trained in metaphysics. So it's my contention that if you want to integrate metaphysical experience, you should have recourse to metaphysics. It's almost a tautology, but it doesn't happen. So this is ultimately my point, and within that, I'm going to argue that Whitehead's metaphysics in particular could be especially effective. What do I mean by metaphysical experience then? What do I mean by metaphysics? Well, as Dr. Livingston mentioned, the word metaphysics comes from Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics, which literally means after the physics, because a later editor put this collection of texts from Aristotle after Aristotle's texts, the physics, right? So meta means after, so it's literally after the physics. And within that book, you've got a sort of program which defines the study of metaphysics. Aristotle himself, as was mentioned, called it first philosophy. And that's the basis of metaphysics today, though it has been developed. So ontology is a core element of metaphysics, the study of being, as we had a lecture on a few hours ago. So ontology, the study of being, so in terms of, for example, substance, including process, I should say, right? You recall that Whitehead says that he can see he sees his creative impulse as Spinoza's substance, as a way of seeing it. But anyway, so within ontology, you have these theories of physicalism, idealism, dualism, neutral monism, the transcendent, and so on. And as well as those theories, we look at causation, what's meant by causation, what's meant by form, qualities like relations, properties, modality, and so on. Also in Aristotle's metaphysics, book Lambda is about God. So there is a theism within metaphysics from the start. But as Whitehead said, Aristotle was the last metaphysician to present a non-religious God, interestingly. So I've created with some colleagues in Exeter what I call the metaphysics matrix, which might be the basis of metaphysical integration in psychedelic therapy. I'm sure many of you in this learned audience would disagree with the way I've categorized metaphysics. But nonetheless, there's no absolute answer, and this is non-exhaustive. But as you can see, we've got physicalism, idealism, dualism, monism, the transcendent. Panpsychism cuts through all of those because, Galen Strawson has a physicalist panpsychism, Leibniz has a kind of idealistic notion of it, and so on. That includes pan-experientialism within it. Okay, that's hard to see on this screen. Here's a more basic version of these different options. I just make this, in my personal experience, when you speak to, I'm part of the psychology department as well as philosophy department in Exeter. When I speak to psychologists, and most people on the street, as it were, they think there are two metaphysical options, and those are physicalism or dualism. And they don't realize that there's a huge array of different options. Even that, of course, is not exhaustive. And there's another one as well, of course, the transcendent. Okay, so that's metaphysics as I understand it. I've spoken about what I call intellectual metaphysics, so like systems or analysis of things such as causation, substance, and whatever. We have, in the past, I should say, a kind of systematic intellectual metaphysics, so the big systems. You could include Whitehead's system of philosophy of organism as such a system. But in the 20th century, or in the late 20th century, after metaphysics was killed off for a while, it returned, and the metaphysical turned, about 30 years ago, I suppose, in analytic philosophy, and in that form of metaphysics, which I've taught at Exeter, it's kind of bitty. So you analyze what causation means, for example. You analyze what self-identity means, and so on. It's not the big systems that you had in the past with people like Schopenhauer and Hegel and whatnot. So there's intellectual metaphysics that we teach at university. But then there's experiential metaphysics as well. William James, for example, writes this: in the nitrous oxide trance, we have a genuine metaphysical revelation. So there's, in other words, two ways of grasping a metaphysical system. One is, through recourse to reading, studying, and so on. But there are, it seems, direct intuitions that one can have as well. Deleuze, for example, speaks about Spinozism. He says you can learn Spinoza's metaphysics through, years of study, the ethics especially, or you can have this flash of Spinozism, he says. You can get it in a flash, this pantheistic insight. Now, mysticism is also experiential, mystical states, that's what William James writes about, but it can be doctrinal as well, if we think about people like St. John of the Cross and whatever. But what I'm interested in is this intersection between mystical states and metaphysical experiential states. There is an overlap. But of course, there's many parts of metaphysics which are not part of mysticism. For example, the dry study of mental causation, maybe. And then we have a third cycle here, psychedelic experience. So there is a variety of psychedelic experiences. There's not just one. There are psychedelic experiences which have got nothing to do with metaphysics and have got nothing to do with mysticism. For example, just simply laughing, maybe, with laughing gas. Or if you look at psychedelic experiences reported from the indigenous Americans in the South, they have experiences where they become better warriors, or better hunters, or where they can heal their friends or curse their enemies. It doesn't really relate to metaphysics or mysticism. But nonetheless, there is an overlap, and it's in that overlap where I think Whitehead's metaphysics can be beneficial. So I'm just going to give you now a few examples of metaphysical experience. Why? Because when people have these experiences in therapy, my argument is that if we can frame those experiences in some kind of metaphysical system, it can aid the significance of those experiences to people undergoing therapy. So just a few experiences here. This is from the astrophysicist Carlo Rovelli. He writes, quote, LSD was an extraordinarily strong experience that touched me also intellectually. Among the strange phenomena was the sense of time stopping. Things were happening in my mind, but the clock was not going ahead. The flow of time was not passing anymore. It was a total subversion of the structure of reality. That's what got him into physics, that experience, he writes. From the great philosopher of mind, Jae-won Kim, who died only a couple of years ago, he writes, why are there just these qualia, like colors, sounds, whatever, and not other possible ones? That remains a mystery. It's interesting, with a number of psychedelic experiences, you can have novel qualia. You have qualia which just cannot be categorized as a color, a sound, an emotion, a feeling, or whatever. They're just completely alien. I'll come back to that when we think about eternal objects. Richard Ward, 1957, on LSD. It's impossible to convey the horror of thus being threatened with sheer nothingness, the fear of infinity. I wished I had the courage to try and find out where one is if one is nowhere. It's not always positive, these experiences, I should say. Here's one on nature connectedness. Quite an extreme form of prehension, you might think. Quote, I found my awareness slipping inside that of the daffodil. While still being conscious of sitting in the chair, I could also sense my petals. Then an exquisite sensation cascaded through me, and I knew I was experiencing light falling on those petals. It was virtually orgasmic, the haptic equivalent of an angelic choir. This is from my colleague, a research fellow at Exeter, also based in Brazil, Dr. Luis Eduardo Luna, who's an anthropologist and specialist in ayahuasca, which is a kind of psychedelic brew. Quote, it's impossible to understand Amerindian animist culture without reference to these psychedelic plants. So when you look at the Amerindian cultures who commonly use psychoactive substances, they are completely correlated with a metaphysics that they have, which is generally animist. And of course, animism is very much related to panpsychism, pan-experientialism. From Richard Ward again, relating to panpsychism, I realized on 100 micrograms LSD that the whole universe is made up of things which have their own natures, relationships, significances, and that in some universal scale, each thing has its proper degree of awareness. Alan Watts, on pantheism, that nature is God. The individual discovers himself to be one continuous process with God, with the universe. To those who have known it, it is as real and overwhelming as falling in love. Benny Shannon, who went to the Americas and created really the first taxonomy of the ayahuasca experience, he concludes that research thus. Overall, ayahuasca induces a comprehensive metaphysical view of things. I would characterize it as an idealistic monism with pantheistic overtones. I'm not quite sure what that means. 2 minutes, right. Reality is conceived as constituted by one non-material substance, which is identified as cosmic consciousness. Spinoza would accept them. Albert Hoffman quotes Goethe, referencing Spinoza. In the last chapter of his book, he writes, "What more can a person gain in life than that God nature reveals himself to him?" God nature, of course, referring to Spinoza's thought that God is nature. Integration phase, very quickly, I've got 2 minutes, right. So psychedelics, people get to know the therapists, they take the drug in a clinical atmosphere, and then they go through integration. Now, what is integration? There are various methods of integration. There's at least 10 core methods, none of which involve metaphysics at all. So my contention then is that these core experiences which have a therapeutic effect in psychedelic therapy, those experiences can be amplified through understanding, through a kind of metaphysical menu at the last stage, that what they've experienced need not necessarily be a delusion. Rather, it could be veridical, it could be objectively true. For example, a panentheistic insight. This is where Whitehead, for example, comes in and says, makes a good rational case for these kind of metaphysical experiences, so that therefore you place the metaphysical experience within a metaphysical system. My contention is, by doing this, a participant might attain a longer-term health benefit because they are less likely to dismiss their experiences as delusive. Because they will quickly, although at the time there's a noetic quality, as William James says, to the experience, at the time they might feel it's real. As they return to our culture, they will think, no, that must be wrong in our physicalist culture. So offering them in an intelligible manner this metaphysical menu might allow for them to gain extra significance from that experience in terms of panentheism, prehension, especially in terms of nature connectedness, and in many other ways. So I've got a lot more to say, but I realize I'm out of time. So thank you for your time.
So we have a wonderful array of speakers. We have a metaphysician first, and then we have an author, speaker, singer, and spiritual mentor, and afterwards we have a biologist. So it couldn't be more diverse than that. So Dr. Sherry Kling is an author, speaker, singer. I asked her to sing for us after the break, but maybe it's not part of the program. And she draws from the mystical traditions, the relational worldview, and also, as you learn, from depth psychology of Carl Gustav Jung. And she will give us a presentation about, she calls herself a midwife. She's trying to midwife wholeness in individual, how the Jungian notion of the self versus the ego can help us to understand deep conversion in people, that will help us to understand eschatology and what is meant in theology by eschatological terms. She is author of A Process, Spirituality, Christian and trans-religious resources for transformation. And I'm very glad that we have you here, Sherry. It's all yours.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. I'll mention really quick, I neglected to include in my bio that I got my PhD in process studies from Claremont School of Theology in 2017, and before that, a Master of Arts in Theological Studies from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And the title of my paper is The Inner Eschaton, Self and Divine in Transformation. In their introduction to process theology, John Cobb and David Griffin open their chapter on eschatology with a quote from Teilhard de Chardin, who writes in Science and Christ, "We too often forget that what we call evolution develops only in virtue of a certain internal preference for survival, which in humans takes on a markedly psychic appearance in the form of a zest for life." Teilhard goes on to say that if life is just an endless circling toward death within a closed system, then humans would be fundamentally discouraged and lose that zest for life. Ultimately, zest is related to hope. Cobb and Griffin then present two aspects of Whitehead's thinking that provide hope for history. First, the radical openness of the future, and second, the possibility of progress. Yet they acknowledge that openness and progress are not enough to inspire zest. They say we need some intermediate forms of hope, more radical than the amelioration of our present problems, but more proximate than an ultimate consummation in Teilhard's omega point. The hope we need, argue Cobb and Griffin, is for a radical change in the very quality of our existence. Now, as a constructive theologian focused on psychospiritual wholeness and transformation, I believe that theology should always serve and solve real-world problems. The problem that I want to address today is rampant hopelessness and loss of zest that I believe is caused by an inner cleavage due, at least in part, to human alienation from our divine identity and original wholeness. Biblical insights into this alienation are conveyed through the story of the Garden of Eden, and Fraser and Watts, drawing from Edward Edinger's work, describes how the story represents, quote, an original state of psychic wholeness and is, in a sense, an image of the self with a capital S. A clue to the garden as an image of wholeness is the four rivers that divide it into a kind of mandala, with the tree of life at the center. In the garden, there is as yet no self-consciousness, no distinct ego, no conceptual contrasts, and no conflict. In Jungian theory, the move towards a more differentiated consciousness, an ego consciousness, is accompanied by inflation, the tendency of the ego to overreach itself and identify with the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Then, quoting Jung, Watts writes, there is deep doctrine in the legend of the fall. It is the expression of a dim presentiment that the emancipation of ego consciousness was a Luciferian deed. Man's whole history from the beginning is a conflict between his inferiority and his arrogance. Pardon the gendered language. Although much of Christian theology has interpreted the story of the garden as one of a fall into disobedience, sin, and death, many besides Jung have viewed the myth as reflecting the human evolution toward greater psychic consciousness. In Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, Elaine Pagels notes that Gnostic writers describe the human condition as one of internal alienation from our original wholeness, where humanity fell into ordinary consciousness and lost contact with its divine origin. Unfortunately, human alienation is hardly being adequately addressed by those who could help. Over time, Griffin argues, the church's emphasis came to center on doctrinal beliefs about God's past and future actions in the world without, quote, the sense of a present experience of God that marked Jesus' life and that of the early church. For Jung, another factor is that our religious symbols have lost the power to, quote, mediate the transcendent factors they once did. They are no longer alive. In short, we no longer understand ourselves as related to a divine reality that can facilitate our wholeness and transformation. What I will argue here is that when we draw from Whitehead, Jung, and process and integral theologies to reimagine key aspects of Christian intuitions regarding eschatological hope around what God will do at the end of history, what emerges is a trans-religious message of transformation. When we see the eschaton first as an inner event that precedes any outer manifestation of a new heaven and new earth, we may experience renewed hope and zest for life due to that radical change in our very existence to which Cobb and Griffin point. When Paul's letter to the Romans links transformation to the renewal of the human mind, it connects with Cobb's and Griffin's understanding of the way the structure of human existence is transformed when radical change occurs in human self-understanding. In this presentation, I am calling such radical change the inner eschaton. Generally, in Christian and Jewish and Islamic theology, eschatology is the name given to the study of the last things or the end of things. Yet a broadening of this term may reap trans-religious fruits. One way to expand our understanding of the term eschaton and its realization of what is called either the kingdom of God, the reign of God, or the divine commonwealth is to shift it temporally from the future to the now. When Jesus says that the kingdom of God is at hand or among you, this illustrates such a shift. Whitehead makes a similar move when he describes the peace achieved by knowing ourselves as everlastingly cherished in God as, quote, a spiritual consummation of our lives here and now. But we can expand our understanding of eschatology in yet another way. In the Church Event, a book by Lutheran theologian Vitor Vastelli, he writes that the word eschaton can be used both in a temporal sense, as in the last days, and in a spatial sense, where it becomes, quote, the ultimate in place, the outer limit, the borderline. In this sense, it can also signify a turning point, conversion, or metanoia, what he calls a transmutation of the mind to beyond its own confines. For Vastelli, this turning point may also be a place where opposites, such as beginnings and endings, grace and judgment, or the presence and absence of God, meet, or we might say, where bifurcations are reunited. In his other text, The Scandalous God, Vastelli argues that God's revelation in Christ marks a point of reversal, and the cross of Jesus stood at the hinge of the turning, at a critical turning point of transition, and the axis of inversion from one state to the other entails the moment in which the end is at the same time the beginning. Dietrich Bonhoeffer also describes our encounter with Christ as a borderline experience, one in which Christ stands for me on the boundary of my existence, in the place where I should be able to stand but cannot, in a place between me and me, the old and the new existence. Thus, Christ is at one and the same time my boundary and my rediscovered center. In his introduction to Christ the Center, translator Edwin H. Robertson describes Bonhoeffer's understanding of Paul's renewing of the mind not as an externally coercive process, but as an inner growing as a result of the power of Christ working within, until the individual becomes fully human, Christ-like, because that is what humans are intended to be. When we engage Jung on the question of becoming fully human, Carl Jung, we locate this transformation in the human psyche as his process called individuation. In this process, material from the unconscious is brought to conscious awareness for integration, and the aspect of the psyche that mediates this process is the archetypal self. Jung equates the self, again with a capital S, with the divine imprint in the human psyche, what Scripture calls imago Dei. According to Watts, our inner alienation from the self, quote, symbolizes the separation of humanity from God. The journey of the ego back into relationship with the self parallels the journey of humanity back into relationship with God. Theologian Paul Tillich terms this reunion with God the new being and sees it as an existential shift actualized in the concrete life of Jesus of Nazareth, who, he writes, brings a new state of things. Using eschatological terms, Tillich describes the new being as the bringer of the new eon, and this new eon is the conquest of the situation under the law, which is the old situation. He says, Christ is the end of existence lived in estrangement, conflicts, and self-destruction. He who participates in the newness of being, which is in Christ, has become a new creature. Returning to process theology, we find a similar presentation of the Christ, or Logos, as the immanent primordial nature of God, that is a pattern present in all things, both animate and inanimate. Resonant with Jung's self, the Logos, or immanent Christ, provides a pattern of wholeness that, when embodied in living things, creatively transforms them by drawing them toward novel expressions. Therefore, the source of creative transformation and novelty is the Christ. This luring pattern is not present only in Christians. It is available to all, but its power, according to Cobb and Griffin, is, quote, most fully present when and effective where people believe in creative transformation, understand it rightly, trust it, and open themselves to it. Because believers have been open to Christ as creative transformation by Jesus' work, they argue that we can justify the close association of creative transformation with him. But in a postmodern world, we know we cannot just leave it there. Griffin rightfully notes that from a pluralistic approach, Jesus cannot be taken as a model for humanity in general in some simple sense. Jesus can, however, be seen as a model with regard to the relation to the biblical God. G. Clark Chapman asserts something similar for Jung in the idea that, quote, for those in the West, the God image is best seen in Christ, just as elsewhere in the world it might appear through the Buddha or Tao, unquote. When we look at the Christ event psychologically, Jung believes that Christ represents a totality which corresponds to the total personality that transcends consciousness. He writes that Christ exemplifies the archetypal self. In a 1957 letter to Reverend David Cox, Jung states clearly why the archetypal self is not bound by any specific religious tradition, but is quite naturally pluralistic. He writes, if this collective archetype had not been associated with Jesus, he would have remained a nameless tzaddik, or Jewish spiritual leader. It's not the Jewish rabbi and reformer Jesus, but the archetypal Christ who touches upon the archetype of the Redeemer in everyone and carries conviction. I actually prefer the term self because I am talking to Hindus as well as Christians, and I do not want to divide but to unite. There is no reason whatsoever why you should or should not call the beyond self Christ or Buddha or Purusha or Tao or Kedir or Tifereth. All these terms are recognizable formulations of what I call the self. Moreover, I dislike the insistence upon a special name, since my human brothers and sisters are as good and valid as I am. Why should their name-giving be less valid than mine? End quote. From a process perspective, we might say that Jesus actualized in a concrete life the archetypal self. In this way, he has made the possibility of transformative integration and full humanity more available to all of us, because that possibility now comes both from God and from the past. In addition, as I've argued elsewhere, when we integrate Whitehead and Jung, we gain a view of the archetypal self as possibly the historic route of one's initial aims, thereby making it a processive immanence of the divine in the human psyche. In order to return to the garden's original wholeness with the gifts of our individual consciousness intact, the ego must finally bow to the self, to this divine self. When that happens, the tension of the opposing forces within us are held without repressing either side, and we are then in Christ, crucified on our own crosses. The ego's surrender to the self makes it possible to transcend the paradox of human life, moving from despair and hopelessness into a transformed rebirth, integrated wholeness, and the utter fullness of God. If we agree that in these ways the Christ, psychological, historical, and cosmic, is somehow directly involved in the transformation of human experience from fragmentation to wholeness and despair to hopefulness, then we might agree with Doug King, creator of the Presence podcast, when he says that Christology is eschatology. In what he calls integral theology, King uses spiral dynamics to approach the biblical narrative, seeing it ultimately as a story of universal God identity. As human consciousness has developed over time through various stages, transcending and including previous levels, we move from what is called Tier 1 consciousness to Tier 2 consciousness. Tier 1 in the spiral dynamic system is all about self as source, where the ego grasps to achieve God identity through human action, law, or right belief. In this understanding, the emergence of law inherently brings separation, sin, and death. But for King, the Christ event marks the turning point from Tier 1 to Tier 2, and a move from form through transform to formlessness. In Tier 2, form plays a role and function, but it is not the source of our God identity. This transformative move from one tier to another echoes what we have already seen in Tillich's New Being, who conquers our separation and situation under the law, bringing a new eon. It also resonates with Bonhoeffer's boundary between the old and new existence, and with Vestelli's turning point, where the end is the beginning. We see it in process theology's radical change to a new state of existence, and in Jung's sense that we continue Christ's incarnation and transformation through choosing the path of individuation. As Chapman describes, and again, please forgive the gendered language, for it is not a question of an imitation that leaves a man unchanged and makes him into a mere artifact, but of realizing the ideal on one's own account, in one's own individual life. That is what forces us to live life completely, an adventure which is often as heroic as it is tragic. A complete life, unconditionally lived, is the work of the Holy Spirit. This is the aim of the incarnation as well as the creation, which wants each being to attain its perfection. According to King, the purpose of any religious narrative, biblical or otherwise, is to transform, not to ask us to attach to it as a source of identity. When we connect eschatological hope directly to individual human experience and to the human psyche, then we describe an inner eschaton that is available to all universally. We can then see resurrection as detaching from old paradigms and rising to a new one where God identity is universal. When we understand the work of the immanent divine, no matter by what name it is called, as one of transformation in the here and now, then we have a transreligious and eschatological message of hope that can foster true zest for life. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Merlin Sheldrake. Many of you already know his New York Times bestseller book, Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our World, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures, a much discussed book. He received a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University, and he's a research associate at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And today, he wants to bring together constructively Whiteheadian metaphysics and fungi and networks of fungi. Fungi or fungi? I don't even know. It's fungi? Yeah. So, networks of fungi, and interpret those with an Whiteheadian metaphysics. So I find that very intriguing, and I'm waiting for your talk.
Well, thank you very much. It's really great to be here. And I love Peter's idea of the metaphysical menu. I wish that those entering their training in the natural sciences were offered a metaphysical menu. I think often of Whitehead's line, something along the lines of, when scientists say that they don't like metaphysics, what they mean is they don't like their metaphysics being questioned. Metaphysics is not an option. We all must have a ground of being. We all have a world view. So I'm going to talk to you today about a collaboration. This is a collaboration between me, playing the part of a fungal biologist, and Matt Seagal, who's here in the room, playing the part of a process relational metaphysician. This is a dipolar project. I'm the biological pole, and Matt is the metaphysical pole. This is an open-ended conversation. It is in process. It is very much in exploratory mode, and we don't know where it will go. And if we do this correctly, that will remain the case. So in short, we're wondering whether it might be possible to glean some metaphysical lessons from the study of fungi, and in return, whether fungi might be gateway organisms for a return of process relational thinking to the biological sciences. There's a rich history of process relational thinking in the biological sciences, as we'll all know. I think particularly of the real rich period, the Theoretical Biology Club, Waddington, Woodger, Paul Weiss, and others. But it was marginalized by the Neo-Darwinian orthodoxy, and I think Matt and I both feel like this is a ripe time for a renewal of process relational thinking within biology. This collaboration is also a symbiotic interaction. I think this is a helpful framing. I study ecology. I study the ways that organisms relate to one another. And within the ecological sciences, and particularly when we think about microbial life, it becomes very clear that there's no such thing as an individual. Life is symbiosis all the way down. We contain more microbes than our own cells, without which we couldn't do what we do and be who we are. Big bacteria contain smaller bacteria. Bacteria can contain viruses, and large viruses can contain smaller viruses. As many process relational biologists have said, that the smallest unit of analysis in the living world is the relationship. In this spirit, we feel that at this time, that forming symbiotic relationships across disciplines can help us meet many of the pressing challenges that we face. If we look at the history of life, it becomes clear that crisis is a crucible for new symbiotic relationships. And I feel like at this time of many crises that interdisciplinarity is a superpower. And Matt and I are playing a small experiment here in different ways that might unfold. It all began when I attended Matt's course on Whitehead at Schumacher College, and I was engrossed. And one day I was walking back from the course, wrestling with some of these ideas, and it struck me in a second. I suddenly thought, hang on a sec, Whitehead's metaphysical schema sounds rather like a multi-dimensional fungal network growing from many tips, all connected to one another. And this realization really helped Whitehead's thinking make sense for me. It was a powerful moment. Another powerful moment, by the way, I don't know if any of you have tried this. Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians. If you haven't tried this, and I thoroughly recommend it. For me, it's a soundtrack to Whitehead's metaphysical schema. If you get into a receptive state and put on your Whiteheadian lens and listen to that piece of music, perhaps you'll see something of what I felt from that. Strongly recommended. But it also became clear to me, not only could fungal biology help me understand Whitehead, but the Whitehead could help me understand fungal biology. Fungal life is so strange. Fungal behaviors trick us out of many of the presuppositions that we use to organize our lives, our societies, our economies, our politics, our theologies. They trouble and corrode many of the categories that we often take for granted. Individuality, autonomy, intelligence, and many others. But fungi are precisely the kind of creature that we would expect to find within a process relational universe. And so, armed with this process relational thinking, fungal life stopped being so strange and actually became coherent and to be expected, and really helped me do my fungal biology. Of course, all life is what we'd expect to see with a process relational lens, but I think fungi make it very clear, as I'll go on to say. So fungi are a kingdom of life. This is as broad and busy a category as animals or plants. But when we think of fungi, we normally think of mushrooms. But mushrooms are just the reproductive structures of fungi, the place where they produce spores. Most fungi live most of their lives not as mushrooms, but as branching, fusing networks of tubular cells. And these networks are called mycelial networks. Mycelial networks are how fungi feed. Animals tend to find food in the world and put it inside their bodies. Fungi do it the other way around and put their bodies inside their food. Mycelial networks are a very effective way to do so. Growing from growing tips, these networks burrow into their surroundings and digest their surroundings, absorb them and shuttle them around their rambling networks of bodies. Mycelium is extraordinary stuff. If you teased apart the mycelium in a healthy teaspoon of soil, it would stretch anywhere from 100 meters to 10 kilometers. Mycelium is ecological connective tissue, a living seam by which much of the living world is woven into relation. Fungal mycelium strings itself between plants, winds its way between plant cells in their leaves and in their shoots. You'll find fungal mycelium in and around animal bodies, both alive and dead, holding together the soil. Take away the mycelium and the soil would wash away, but there wouldn't be any soil in the first place because soil is a product of mycelial activity. Alexander von Humboldt had a wonderful line. He described the living world as a net-like entangled fabric. And in my mind, fungal mycelium makes this net and fabric real. So I want to rehearse the process by which a mycelial network might form. And I was hoping that it might be possible. That's good? Okay. Great, okay, so we don't need to play it just yet. So we start with a spore. And a spore would germinate into a single fungal cell. You can see 5 fungal cells there. They're called hyphae. They are tubular in structure, and they grow from their tips. They grow by getting longer. They prolong themselves. New material is laid down at their tips, and when that material has been laid down, it becomes part of the tube and does no longer grow. The fungal tips are the parts of the fungi that do the most. They are the part of the fungi that are the most active. So fungal cells are streams of embodiment guided by their tips. Maybe you could play this video. I think of these tips, these fungal growing tips, as rather like actual occasions. So fungal cells grow out of their relation to their past. But fungal cells, hyphae, they don't stay single for long. They branch and they fuse into the anarchic filigree of mycelium. The growing tips multiply into novel togetherness. Could we play the next video? Thank you. So note the branching and the fusing. So in this state, fungi are able to explore their surroundings. And remember, this is how they feed. This is a kind of appetite in bodily form. They're seeking, we can only presume, in seeking food, ever more intense satisfaction of their appetites. Their behavior is really astonishing. They're maze dwellers. They live in the cluttered obstacle course of the soil. And people have tested them with little microscopic mazes. And you watch the fungal hypha enter the maze, and it does strange things there. When presented with a forked path, it doesn't have to choose one or the other. It just branches and takes both routes. In doing so, it's able to find, after a while, the shortest path between entrance and exit. But in watching this behavior, as you watch this video, it's difficult to work out whether this organism is singular, one single interconnected network, or is it plural? Is it a multitude of hyphal tips? And of course, it's both. And I think it's both in a very astonishing way. So these are webs of becoming. And mycelial networks reflect the cumulative character of time. They're, in a sense, portraits of time, cartographical representations of a fungus's recent history. They leave behind them a trail of their past, which enables their present. And they're highly indeterminate. No 2 mycelial networks are the same. You could take 2 fragments of a single fungal culture and grow them, and they would form quite different networks depending on where they were growing. They decant themselves into their surroundings. They're sort of inseparable from their surroundings. It's possible to ask what shape mycelium is without also asking where it happens to be growing and with whom it happens to be growing. There's no point at which a mycelial network can be said to be fully grown. These are bodies without body plans. Can we play the next video? Yes. So these are all spread up, by the way. And can we play the next one as well? So this is a fungus devouring an orange. Look at the intensity of that satisfaction. Unbelievable. It's going to start sporulating. There we go. Great. So we can just leave the videos for the moment. Thank you. Mycelial networks are sensitive bodies. They are bathed in rich fields of sensory information. They're sensitive to light, to any number of chemicals, to acidity, pressure, temperature, and they're able to integrate these data streams without having a brain to do so. They integrate these data streams at their growing tips. Each growing tip is somehow informed by what's going on in every other growing tip. The growing tips are all connected in a single network, and yet they're making locally suitable decisions based on what's around them and the many possibilities that they face. The growing front of mycelial networks scour instabilities in search of new niches, and indeed, they create niches, they create environments. Their decomposition gives rise to soil. They create many different types of environment. They create the space in which we live. Fungal decomposition of wood. Without fungal decomposition of wood, we would be buried kilometers deep in the bodies of animals and plants. So we live and breathe in the space that fungal activity leaves behind, another way that they create environments. And they relate to other organisms in astonishing ways. Closest to my heart are the fungi that form symbiotic relationships with plants. Almost all plants depend on fungi that live in and around their roots. The fungi are expert foragers in the cluttered wild west of the soil. They can forage for mineral nutrients, which they absorb, transport through their bodies, and exchange with plants. The plants can give the fungi access to energy-containing carbon compounds like sugars and fats that they've produced in photosynthesis. This exchange is prolific. It was only with the help of fungi that the ancestors of plants were able to make it onto the land about 500 million years ago. It's a foundational relationship in the whole terrestrial biosphere, and it continues to this day. And watching it happen is quite amazing. A fungus might germinate in the soil. A plant root is growing in the soil. The plant root releases plumes of volatile chemicals which act as a lure for the fungus. The fungus grows towards this lure, releasing in turn chemicals which act as a lure to the plant root. They both change their whole developmental procedures. They can influence each other's development by producing hormones that act on each other. And they come together in a clasp, a generative clasp that is constantly negotiated between them and rehearses a foundational moment in the history of all life. A fungal network, after this relationship is formed, might find itself strung between the roots of tens of plants over tens of meters, engaged in very different metabolic activities in different parts of its network, engaged in uncountably large numbers of trading decisions with different plant roots in an ongoing processual way. So why bother looking for organic instances of Whitehead's schemas? First, as happened to me, fungi can, I think, help to communicate otherwise quite abstract ideas that we find in Whitehead's thought. They literally ground our discussion. Fungi they create the ground that we walk on, and they are very much, metabolically speaking, the ground of our being. Much of the stuff, much of the matter in your body will have passed through a mycorrhizal fungal network on its way to you. So, can these fungi help us talk about difficult ideas? I think so. They certainly have helped me. But perhaps there's more than that. Could fungal dynamics help illuminate some of the outstanding questions that we find in Whitehead's thought? Could this be a site of experience that might inform metaphysical work? I'm not sure. This is a real question. But it's interesting that the earliest evidence for mycelium dates from 2.4 billion years ago in the form of fossils, which are puzzling fossils for people because they occur long before multicellularity is supposed to have arisen, and long before fungi are supposed to have evolved. But they are, to this date, the earliest gesture towards multicellular life that we have on record. Could this tell us something about the nature of reality? And also, perhaps fungi can help generate useful metaphors that can do useful work for us, help us to see in new ways, feel in new ways, and explore in new ways. So we're excited. We're excited about the ways that fungi might lure us into returning process relational thinking to the biological sciences, displacing a reductive, mechanistic, metaphysical schema that not only struggles to cope with the generative unruliness of the living world, but also renders the universe needlessly dull. Thank you.
Well, thank you, speakers, for all ending right on time without needing much discipline, to be disciplined by me. So I do a round of one question to each one of you, and then since in earlier sessions we experienced that there are many questions, I open it up after one question. So I start in the same sequence as we give the presentations. So Peter, we know that the effects from like DMT or other drugs, so that they have a therapeutic effect is because they make it easier to rewire the brain. So they give us more neural plasticity, so that if a person has, for example, an addiction problem, after a DMT session, they can easily rewire their brain, and often they do, so that they get rid of the addiction problem. So what would metaphysics do? Would metaphysics also rewire our brains then? Or would we just like have the Whiteheadian plane is like a conceptual trip up, so, and then we need to land after the conceptual trip and have a deeper experience? Or is it more like, and that's what I think actually, it's more like Frankl's logotherapy, that at some point we have to make sense of it all, because humans are meaning creatures. We want meaning, and metaphysics gives us meaning. So what in addition to the drug experience does metaphysics really give us?
Okay. Well, it's interesting because there are developments now to create psychedelic drugs which have no phenomenology at all, so that they only work on the brain. But there are many skeptics for that procedure. Number one, because psychedelic means mind manifesting, so it's not really a psychedelic if it doesn't manifest the mind. Secondly, though, I think it's related to your work on mental causation to some extent, that the real therapeutic mechanism of psychedelics is that it creates, as it were, a small self. It gives people a perspective on their life where their life and their problems become relatively unimportant, and their table of values changes, is altered. So therefore, as a result of which, they don't need to, for example, mask their problems with alcohol, because their problems seem relatively irrelevant. The mechanism of that, of course, is the experience itself. It's what I call, a metaphysical experience. So that is, I would say, a crucial aspect of that psychedelic therapeutic process. Of course, it would be correlated to the brain in some manner, but I don't think, as a Whiteheadian, that, you get the full causal sufficiency by looking at matter only, or abstraction that is matter. You have to realize that matter is an abstraction which includes mind, and therefore the phenomenological sort of downward causation of such an experience is as causally efficacious as anything in the brain. as a quick answer.
Thank you very much. Sherry, thank you for your very inspiring talk, overcoming alienation through integration and finding the eschaton as an inner event. It's also an historical event, it's also an event in the future of some objectivity, but I would be interested how you relate those two aspects of the eschaton. So if a believer says, I believe in the resurrection, and we would tell her that this is just an inner psychological event, she might think I misunderstood. So do you believe that, like, the individual resurrection is really also an inner psychological event, so that it's an inner transformation into a different reality? So what is exactly, in your view, the relationship between what psychology describes, Jungian psychology, and this otherworldly, transcendent eschaton? How do you see the relationship between the objective and the inner eschaton?
Well, I think that, when Christ calls us to carry our own cross, he's not suggesting that every person needs to go be crucified and experiment with possibly being resurrected again in the way that Christians believe Jesus was. So clearly he's talking about an inner shift, some kind of a dying to self, and that possibility of being reborn into a new way of living. And so I think that the inner eschaton, to me, is that preceding change that then changes the way we live in the world. And whether or not there is what the future eschaton might look like, I have no idea. And whether the new heaven and new earth means that that's some kind of objective change to the way the entire world appears to us or is experienced by us, I don't know. But I do know that we can experience an inner change that is so significant that it changes everything about the way we live in the world. So I would see that the inner eschaton allows for that kind of change, and as developmental creatures, we're still in a process of development. But I think the more individuals can experience that kind of radical shift, I believe it will change the way we live in the world, the way we treat the earth and each other, the way we treat the non-human beings in the world. And then whatever happens beyond that, if there is an eschaton that is a different new heaven and new earth, I wouldn't want to really speculate on that.
Thank you very much. So my final questions before I hand over to the audience. Merlin, very fascinating talk about Whitehead and fungi. Whitehead wanted to replace substance metaphysics by a metaphysics of experience and subjectivity. So I was wondering, where is the subjectivity in your model? And it seemed to me it's in the tip of the fungus, so to speak. That's where the creativity is, the openness to the future. So the rest of it, like what's that in Whiteheadian metaphysics? And that seems to be the relation part. And you said at one point, is it tips or networks? And you said it's both. And that seems to me to mirroring the idea that in Whiteheadian ontology, it's not you have the relation first and then the relata, or you have the relata first and then the relation, because they come at the same moment, so to speak. They're both equally ontologically fundamental, because there is no relatum without relationships and no relationship without relata. So it's more a question, have I understood it correctly? So that's it's mirroring somehow Whiteheadian ontology, because we have like the actual entity in the tip, that's where the experience is, the creativity, but they are connected to all the other tips, so to speak, by this vast network of prehensions, and that's facilitated in your picture, so to speak. That's how they are called, the connections. I don't know the English word even for these threads or
the hyphae.
Yeah, by them. So I'm still a bit struggling about the Whiteheadian metaphysics. That's what I understood. Maybe you can elaborate on it.
Yeah, no, I think you put your finger completely on, precisely on the point of uncertainty and imperfection with this comparison, which, so of course we're dealing here with a space for time substitution, which is one of the reasons why it's easy to grasp, because you can see it there, but in a Whiteheadian schema, the process that is the present moment of concrescence is happening now on top of collections, aggregations of past decisions that layer on complex roots through time. And so exactly as you said, so the growing tips, so the actual occasions, the pulse of their growing is the concrescence. The past decisions are the tube, the pipe that they left behind them, which relate to all other past decisions through the network that they form together. And so all the concressing moments that occur in any one of these tips is informed by what's happened in the past, because they are all part of that big network of past decisions, which remains in front of our eyes here in this pedagogical way. So the question is, given that this is a network here and now in the present, and these are tubes through which matter is passing, this isn't just the past, this isn't just objective immortality, these are active parts of the fungus. Stuff is passing through these tubes. And so this does raise the question, it suggests a kind of activity for the past, and I know this is a subject of debate among Whiteheadians, how active is the past. So this is a point where the analogy perhaps breaks down. I hope that makes it clearer.
Thank you very much. Then we open it up to, and please tell us to whom the question is addressed.
Two quick comments. Playfully, Merlin, and to your comment, Godehard, it looked like the heads of the actual occasions, like actual occasions with tails. And then Sherry asked what the inner eschaton looks like. Well, maybe it looks something like that.
Hi, thank you to all of you. That was really fascinating. My question's for Peter, but I want to frame it by just speaking to Merlin's point, the emphasis you made on interdisciplinary scholarship. It's a wholehearted belief of mine that transdisciplinary praxis is absolutely fundamental if we are to properly shift consciousness and change the paradigm incontrovertibly. I'm specifically interested in my PhD research in the intersection of cosmology, higher dimensional mathematics, quantum mechanics, and aesthetics. With that in mind, considering psychedelic experiences and from a conversation I had with the mathematician Ralph Abraham, I understand psychedelics to basically be blasting a hole through the dimensions. Do you think metaphysics is enough in terms of helping people integrate their experience and actualizing the potential of psychedelics and shifting consciousness? Is metaphysics enough, seeing as that could be relegated by mainstream scientists as purely philosophical speculation? Don't we need some sort of cosmological grounding that substantiates metaphysical speculation?
What comes first, physics or metaphysics? This is I won't answer that. I'd say, first of all, let's say it's not enough. It's not sufficient metaphysics integration for psychedelic experience. I always suggest that it's an additional and optional tool that a therapist can make use of. And I've spoken to many therapists on the ground who are, would appreciate such a tool because, like I say, it is a metaphysical experience, right? So number one, I don't think it is sufficient, but I think it's very important. Secondly, do we need to ground metaphysics in a sort of in a cosmology that is respected by physicists? I mean, I think we do. I think physics is insufficient, generally speaking. For a start, I mean, we know that. The basic problem of physics is, relativity theory doesn't cohere with quantum theory, number one, so we know it's incomplete. But secondly, it doesn't say much, if anything, about the mind. And so obviously we can foresee that the future developments will be a fusion between physics and psychology. But of course, to a certain extent, that's what Whitehead provides. So I think that, and the people in this audience, of course, who work on trying to ground physics in a Whiteheadian metaphysics, so that's the way I personally see the future, but there's obviously other futures. With regard to third thing, with regard to dimensions of space and psychedelic experience in my book over there, right? The last chapter is on n-dimensional space in relation to psychedelic experience. And that, interestingly, relates to some of what Whitehead said in an essay called Uniformity and Contingency. He speaks about dreams and dimensions of space in relation to relativity. But it's very interesting if you apply that to psychedelic experience, which you can see as kind of excessive dreams in many ways.
Hi, Jared Morningstar. Question for Sherry. So I really liked the trans-religious approach of your idea of inner eschatology and transformation. But I do have a interest in this aspect of sort of transcending law and how that fits in along with this trans-religious approach. So myself, coming from an Islamic spiritual perspective, legal spirituality, religious law is not merely sort of instrumental, but really at the heart of what transformation and realization of God identity involves. And I can imagine that could be true for certain Jewish or Confucian friends as well. So I'm wondering, how can you sort of incorporate that aspect in your model, or is it sort of inherently going to be a little more antagonistic towards those sorts of legal spiritual perspectives?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. For that, I would draw again back to Doug King's integral theology and say that in the shift from tier 1 to tier 2 and form to formless, you still can use form. Form can still play a role. So I would say law, scripture, other aspects of what we would call form are still play an important role, but in and of themselves, they are not the source of God identity. And the reason for that is because then, when a particular system becomes the source of God identity, it excludes everyone else. And so when we can hold lightly to our systems and see the beauty in them and what they can do for us and the way they can be vehicles and methods for that transformation, then they're a beautiful thing. It's when they become the source of identity that then excludes everyone else that they're a problem. And that causes separation and death.
Oh, hello. Thanks a lot for your presentation. A question for Dr. Kling and Sheldrake. Dr. Kling, so there's a phenomena with social media, with young girls, teenage girls. Somebody on the other side of the world can make a post on your social media, and then that person commits suicide. They're so fragile inside that, a non-entity can drive them in that direction. They have no zest for life. They're hopeless in some way. I grew up in an age where we would just throw that stuff off. I mean, bullying is real, but why would I let a gnat drive me to suicide? And so, my assessment is they've lost an inner strength. There's an inner grit that's lost, and I don't know how a society retrieves that when it's just so pervasive. And I guess British Health Service has good statistics on some. So 40% of teenage girls in Britain have thought about suicide. 30% of them, I think, are on antidepressants and anti-anxiety. So comment on that. And Dr. Sheldrake, could you just comment a little more about metaphor? I'm reading a book by Gabriel Marcel right now, and he talks about, it's a real difference when you talk about participating with people and say relation. When you're participating, you're really acting, and when you feel something, it's different than a sensation. So sensation and relations are kind of ways to stand away and not actually engage. I understand the difference between how we act and our words, but the way we use those words are important. Like Levinas would say, you don't need to have a relation with a person. You owe something to their face. They're right there and you owe them. And so Whitehead would want us to indwell and act and feel things and respond to a face, but we talk about them in kind of objectified terms that distance us. So I wonder if you could talk about how we use the metaphor.
Should I go first? I'll just mention quickly basically the argument in my book is that we're so fragmented at all levels of society, and that Whitehead and Jung provide resources that are integrating. And when you put them together, we see in both of their work, I pulled out 3 core themes. At the level of the cosmos and of the psyche, we see value, value, relationality, and transformation. And then when you combine that with a practice, like dream work is the one that I chose, but there are many others. And I would say to the earlier question that a practice might be another good way to maintain an integration after a psychedelic experience. But when we combine that understanding of cosmos and psyche that has these three elements with a practice that then reveals the truth of those elements, then we know for ourselves that we matter, we belong, and we can experience positive change. And to me, that is a message of hope, that if we can bring people to understand themselves and our whole world in that way, that it carries that meaning. It's not a meaningless world. We are not random, isolated entities unconnected to everything else. And we aren't just the victims of lifetimes of suffering or trauma. We can actually experience positive change. That, to me, is a hopeful message.
Thanks for your question. I would agree with Whitehead that it's very much about our actions, that our actions are vitally important and ultimately what connects us with the web of becoming that we're all a part of. When I talk about metaphor, I'm not saying it's metaphor or action. Rather, that metaphor is just not an option. It's just a way that we, something we always have to use. If you look at our language, you can think of it as a sort of history of past metaphors. These metaphors have become idioms over time, to the point we forget they maybe once were a metaphor, created in a poetic moment, become so normalized that we then forget about it. But these metaphors, I think, are important, right? Because think about the metaphor of the machine. This has governed so much human activity for a very long time. And in the the arising of the mechanical philosophy, the concept of a machine was a heuristic tool. It was, what if we treat the world as if it was a machine, and we'll bracket off formal and final causes over here. No less important, but we can't do such empirical stuff with them. So what if it was like a machine, and then we can do this kind of investigation? But that metaphor metastasized into a metaphysics over the course of a few decades, and has left us in all sorts of problems ever since. So Joseph Needham talks very well about this as well. He talks about metaphors as providing a net of coordinates that can guide our thinking. I think about the armatures, the wire armatures that a sculptor might use to support wet clay. And so this is what I mean with the metaphors as a generative practice, to reimagine our metaphors, to find new coordinates, new nets of coordinates, new wireframes, and to try and displace unhealthy metaphors that might no longer serve us.
Great, thank you. Stephen Smith, both to Peter and Merlin potentially here, when you were talking about coming into after the psychedelic experience and starting to work with the integrating the metaphysics in, particularly with a focus on nature relatedness and developing a deeper sort of conductivity between the human and the natural world, can you develop that a little bit more? And because after the psychedelic experience, there's clearly an afterglow, and then there's a period where it tends to taper off when you look at some of the studies looking at nature relatedness. How would you sustain that? And then, Merlin, I mean, picking up on the biological relatedness, is there a way to, in this metaphysics of the interrelatedness, to bring in the role of fungi as an example of that? Just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, there's a number of empirical studies, as you might know, then, on nature connectedness. So, number one, there's a correlation between nature connectedness, which we could define in many ways, and mental health. So there's that, and that sort of then infuses a lot of investment in companies. And then there's secondary empirical research, led especially by a guy called Sam Gandhi, on how psychedelics can induce nature connectedness and thus help mental health. And I've spoken to Sam Gandhi about this, and that's a description. That's that's what seems to happen. But from a more metaphysical point of view, the interesting question is why? Why does it induce that, or what does it mean? Is that nature connectedness a mere delusion, like a hallucination, as it were, that psychedelics can induce, or is there some kind of truth to it? Is there some veridicality to that nature connectedness? So, and this is where I think Whitehead especially becomes important with regard to his concept of prehensions, which I consider really the key, his greatest gift to humanity. So why? Because the concept, I'm preaching to the converted here, but, as you know, very basically, the theory of prehension is one of direct connection to nature, to the outside world. Well, immediately one's past, but of course, that's one is an abstraction, one is part of the environment. So it's an immediate connection to that which one sees. It's direct. That's why he's a realist as opposed to an idealist. That's why it's called process and reality. We relate, after Bradley's appearance in reality, right? He was an idealist. So what Whitehead can provide more than any other philosopher, I believe, Bergson to a certain extent with his concept of sympathy, if you know that, which I think influenced Whitehead a bit. But what Whitehead's metaphysics can provide is a good, solid foundation to explain that nature connectedness that it seems that psychedelics can amplify. And how can that generally lead to therapy? Well, I think that, again, what it means is in that afterglow period you speak about, where people are more open to metaphysical change, it can provide people with good reasons to accept that prehension of nature connectedness, again, as veridical and not something to be dismissed later on. It also provides a criticism of one's general metaphysic. There is no such thing as a neutral metaphysic. You can't avoid it, right? You're sort of born into it. So I think that's how Whitehead can be used practically in these trials. That's only in the clinic. Of course, for so-called healthy people, it can enrich their life. And there's, I think, the future at the present. The medicinal route is important. It gives a kind of credibility to psychedelic research, but looking to the future, if we take it carefully, unlike what happened in the 60s, there could be some societal enrichment there as well, and that's where Whitehead could play a pivotal role.
Dr. Schell?
Just quickly to say that I think of fungi as kind of ecological poster organisms. All life is lived with other organisms. Ecology is the study of the thicket of relationships that house all organisms in their place and in their time. So I think fungi can help us to think about relation. They can help us to figure ecological relations, but they aren't the only organisms that do that. So I think perhaps the reasons why some of these spending time outside in so-called nature connection can be helpful is because we are returning to a state of being with, and being with that which is not just human. And so in returning to that kind of condition, we are able to find our healthy, remember what it means to be healthy. What it means to be healthy is to be with. It's the togetherness that puts the con in concrescence, I've always assumed. Maybe I'm wrong there.
Well, thank you very much. I think this session was... Okay, I read this as stop it.
So, Dr. Sheldrake, you might have just answered the question I was going to ask you, which is a strange question because it's actually your question. Oops, sorry. I was just saying I was going to ask you a strange question in that it is your own question that I'd like to have you respond to in your amazing book, where you talk about how fungi are veteran survivors of ecological disruption, their ability to cling on and often flourish through periods of catastrophic change is one of their defining characteristics. They are inventive, flexible, and collaborative. With much of life on Earth threatened by human activity, are there ways we can partner with fungi to help us adapt? And let me jump to the end of the next paragraph where you develop that question. Many symbioses, you say, have formed in times of crisis. The algal partner in a lichen can't make a living on a bare rock without striking up a relationship with a fungus. Might it be that we can't adjust to life on a damaged planet without cultivating new fungal relationships? So it just seems to me rather eco-prophetically important questions there. I'd love to hear how you'd answer them.
Well, my short answer would be, I do think that forming new relationships, not just with fungi, but with other animals and other plants, other consortia of animals, plants, bacteria as well, are some of the places we should exactly be thinking about at this time. And there's a lot of precedent for this. Humans have done this for a very long time, of course. If we think about the way we outsource our metabolisms to fungi in the process of fermentation, think about alcohol, think about the making of bread by yeasts, which are fungi, think about the production of miso, soy sauce. These are all fungal processes that we envelop within human culture and which in turn shape the cultures that envelop them in complex feedback loops. Think about the first few times when people started traveling with a horse, how this transformed what's possible transport-wise. There's a wonderful term, a thinker called Natasha Myers uses this term, involution, a rolling or a curling inwards. She contrasts this with evolution, which is this rolling outwards, and she thinks that involution better captures the inventive ways that organisms find ways to live alongside one another creatively, and that this is really what characterizes the history of life. So I think it would also be something we could say characterizes the history of humans. And I think it's somewhere where we could look right now moving forward. There are specific instances I could give with fungi if you would be interested. For example, making new materials out of fungi, leather-like materials. You can grow fungi on agricultural waste products. You can grow these materials in a couple of weeks. You don't need cows. You don't need the fields to feed the cows and so forth. There are ways that we can, fungal medicines, lots of ways that the metabolic ingenuity of fungi could produce medicines that help us restore health to ourselves and other organisms we depend on. There are ways that we might be able to be more mycologically inclusive when we practice forestry or agriculture, for example. So there are lots of ways. And I think it speaks to an evolutionary refrain, and this involution is something I come back to all the time.
Yeah, this is from Merlin. I have not read your book, so I'm sorry if for some reason I'm missing a broader context. But my question is, well, it begins with a comment. You began your talk by saying that through the study of mycology, right, we can see that there are no individuals. Later, when you were describing the growth of mycelium, you said, well, are they singular or are they multitudes? And well, they're both, right? And so I had a kind of a question, because on the one hand, there's this temptation to say, well, by the state of the current science, right, it gives us a great model to understand metaphysics in a more general sense and to generalize from that. But in another sense, that's precisely what Whitehead was saying metaphysics shouldn't do, insofar as if you just base your metaphysics off of Newtonian physics, right, you're going to get it wrong. But the job of metaphysics is rather to correct the overstatements of the special sciences. So I wanted to see if, I mean, as tempting as it is to say, well, look, we can see exactly what Whitehead was trying to communicate in more concrete terms here if we talk mycologically. If we can invert that and say, well, in what way does Whitehead challenge mycology, right, to say that, well, things could be otherwise, right? Because the job of metaphysics is to correct that overstatement. So I was just wondering if you could say anything about, right, inverting the relationship between biology and metaphysics in that sense.
Thank you. Yes, first with the individual's point you raised, yeah, exactly what you describe as the kind of tortured confusion that I experience and many others I know experience when we wrestle with these categories. You know, when we spend a lot of time looking at the world as biologists, it becomes clear that individuality it's not a natural fact, but rather a category that depends on our point of view. We do need to use this concept now and then. It would be difficult to get a passport or to fill in your tax returns if we couldn't depend on this, at least transiently. So yes, I own up to any incoherent confusions that I might have communicated. It will continue to happen. And regarding the point about the metaphysics, yes, so it's For me, I think where I'm coming from, I was taking on board this piece of Whitehead's thought that experience should be something that we take very seriously, and that should be where we begin. And so, why I showed those videos is because looking at my experience that I have within myself in a dark room is an aspect of my experience, but me watching the organisms around me do their thing is also something that I'm experiencing. And so I was talking more with these videos about watching the fungi do their thing. Obviously I'm filtering it through the lens of modern mycology as a discipline, but for me, it was more about returning to the experience of watching and being with these organisms and letting that experience form some kind of route for a metaphysical inquiry. But I have a lot to learn. I'd love to talk more about that maybe afterwards.
Thank you. Since when we started, there were just way fewer people here. Just a reminder, if you Google Munich Whitehead in 2023, you find the website for the conference, and you're all invited to come and submit papers and so on. What is left to me is to thank Peter, Sherry, and Merlin for a wonderful session.
Well, psychedelics, fungi, and the inner eschaton sounds like a good 70s band, doesn't it? If you all are musicians there. We are entering a break time. We have coffee in the back. We will start the last session of the day promptly at 4 o'clock, so we'll see you then.
Can't you put that mic simply more forward? No, simply open the key there and then put it in. It's much longer.
Attacking.
Just as a reminder, guys, some are hard of hearing. Just try to project if you can, or just hold that mic real close. This one? And Dr. Mass, I'll introduce you. You can say a word or two about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Nice and bright.
Take them away from their coffee.
I made some notes and then couldn't read it myself again, so I took the...
I have that trouble with my handwriting a lot.
Yeah.
Especially if I'm doing it quickly, like during a talk
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something. It's like, okay, what did they say? No idea. Never, that's lost to time.
I always feel bad because I'll often type it on my phone, but then you look like the person who's on their phone. But I feel like hopefully at this point, everyone has accepted that we are all on our phones to take
By
notes.
the way, I will not mention that I received your paper at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you. I was so angry with my IT department, you have no idea.
You
And
told
so
me the
I was
story,
like, how can I rewrite this? Oh no. Last night.
But
So we transitioned to Microsoft 365, and they locked me out of my Word on my desktop because you have to log in, and my cloud, so all of the backups, because I'm in another country, so it's fraud, even though I told them I was traveling for this conference. It was great. I love the United Kingdom.
The internet is anything for.
Hopefully you've grabbed some coffee and are ready. And here we've reached our final session of the second day of our 50th anniversary conference. So I'm very excited to invite and to introduce Dr. Helmut Maassen, who teaches philosophy at Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf, Germany. He spent research sabbaticals at Boston University and in a university in Delhi, India. He's even taught at Claremont School of Theology in 2007. He's published several books on A.N. Whitehead and Charles Peirce and numerous scholarly articles on these topics. He's also the International Book Review Coordinator for the Germany of Process Studies. He's the editor of the European Studies in Process Thought, something many of us are certainly familiar with. He's the president both of the German Whitehead Society and the president of the European Society for Process Thought. And at present, his work is integrating aesthetics and music, the aesthetics of music. This, in particular, I think, makes him an apt moderator for our final session on art, beauty, and creativity. Dr. Maassen.
Well, David, thank you for the kind invitation and lining out what we are up to. But let me first return to what Godehard already said, because Godehard Brüntrup and I are organizing the 13th International Whitehead Conference, which we just took off. Well, anyway, the 13th International Whitehead Conference, July 26th to 29th in Munich in the Hochschule for Philosophy. We have the whole building, he said already, for just our conference, so you won't be bothered by commuting this and that way and so on. So our session is called Art, Beauty and Creativity, and I suppose David summarized it, the ABCs of process philosophy. I tend to take that very seriously, not just a pun, because I think aesthetics is a major, if not the major tool of understanding Whiteheadian metaphysics. That has not been noticed for a long time, but recently there are several attempts to focus on aesthetics. Obviously, as you mentioned, I'm one among them, but the Sherborne book on Whiteheadian aesthetics has a clue why one can really claim this fundamental function of aesthetics. Because in the preface by Northrop, he writes, in the early 1920s, when he, meaning Alfred North Whitehead, took me page by page and chapter by chapter through principles of natural knowledge and concept of nature, he often stopped to point out the aesthetic character of the concrete fact from which all science, philosophy, and reflection take their inception. I mean, if you take this seriously, one, I think, is allowed, which I did, to talk of the aesthetic turn in Whitehead. Several publications, like the first volume of a critical edition, if you have a chance to look into it under aesthetics, you will see that Whitehead clearly expresses the notion, the fundamental basics of my approach to metaphysics is aesthetics, which is close to what we have here. There are several new books by colleagues from Prague who have been working on Whiteheadian aesthetics. Kenneth Lafavre, whom some of you might know, has published a book which I find a very attractive title. I would have liked to have used it myself. The ontology, the sound of ontology. Sound of ontology. Well, so far to the background of why I think it's really a very important section we are dealing with. And we have three different people with different approaches to our ABC of process philosophy. The first one being Dr. Alex Haitos. He teaches philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University and was a visiting assistant professor at Ashoka University, which is a research university outside Delhi. And we tried to meet. Last time he was there, but not possible, and they got stuck because of the corona lockdown in India. His research intersects span or history of Western philosophy, the focus on metaphysics, process philosophy, and the philosophy of art. And the two of us have edited a volume in the European Studies of Philosophy, Volume 7, which is called Variations on Process Metaphysics. Variations, of course, thinking of musical forms of variation. Alex, it's all yours.
Thank you, Helmut. I'm going to jump right in. So today I'm going to talk about the role of imagination in Whitehead's philosophy. In particular, I shall make the case that imagination is a crucial element in a Whiteheadian cosmos, and that its importance is tied to its role in promoting and securing the aim at aesthetic intensity that characterizes all actual entities. Some other themes will emerge during this exploration, such as the relationship between imagination, freedom, and art, and I shall use John Dewey to help relate art and aesthetic experience to imagination. But much here is preliminary and will be left for the discussion after the talk. Not only are the themes expansive and time short, but I have only recently begun this exploration of Whiteheadian aesthetics from the vantage point of imagination. Whitehead does not write about imagination in a focused way, and so I have more or less taken for granted its role in aesthetic experience in my previous studies of Whitehead. But the role of imagination is important, tied as it is to freedom and the attainment of richer, deeper experience, that is, to the attainment of beauty. Probing this thought is my goal today. The centrality of imagination in Whitehead's philosophical methodology is what prompted this line of inquiry for me. In the opening chapter of Process and Reality, Speculative Philosophy, Whitehead explains and defends the role of speculation or imagination in philosophical and scientific inquiry. Key to Whitehead's account of philosophic method is the idea of imaginative generalization, where a free imagination takes, extends, modifies, and broadens the applicability of concepts originally limited to a certain region of experience. This is the creation of new, more far-reaching, and more powerful ideas in service of the enhancement and illumination of experience. Without imagination, there is no improvement of understanding or of the conditions of life. Since imagination plays an important role in Whitehead's account of philosophic method and the production of knowledge, and since his philosophical system endeavors to frame ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted, we can therefore ask how the importance of imagination is articulated within the system. For example, how does Whitehead characterize imagination in his system, and is it sufficiently robust to account for the importance imagination has in Whitehead's methodology? This is the question that served as the catalyst for the current inquiry. The short answer to the second part of the question is yes. Whitehead's account of imagination within his system coheres with how he uses and treats imagination methodologically. But this is not what I want to focus on right now. Whitehead does not give imagination a focused interpretation within Process and Reality. Rather, the word is used here and there to describe certain operations within concrescence. It would be easy to read Process and Reality and not pay the idea all that much heed, overshadowed as it is by much more prevalent notions. For example, prehension, eternal object, extension, proposition, order, intensity, da-da-da. Indeed, I have done this. Yet without imagination, nothing interesting would happen in a Whiteheadian cosmos. And I mean this in a fundamental sense. Without imagination, the complexity in organism and environment requisite for interest to emerge would not be attained. Without imagination, an actual entity cannot affect the adjustment of contrasts that constitutes beauty and delivers the heightened intensity of aesthetic experience. I'm here moving imagination from the terminological periphery of Whitehead's system to the center. There might be a little exaggeration in what I was just saying, but I don't think there's much. My point is that for Whitehead, imagination is closely allied to freedom and life. It is difficult to disentangle these three notions such that they have any meaning apart from the others. They are coherent ideas in Whitehead's sense. Within the technical language of Whitehead's system, imagination is closely related to conceptual reversion, that crucial and frankly mysterious categorical obligation. Reversion and imagination are not identical, at least not wholly. At this point, some sorting through of the ways Whitehead writes about imagination will be helpful. This will clear up what I was just saying about conceptual reversion and will put us on the path to understanding the role of imagination in fostering aesthetic experiences. So, the word imagination and its derivatives appear throughout Process and Reality, though not to my eyes with a frequency that stands out. Whitehead does not give a systematic exposition of the concept. The most concentrated discussion of imagination in its systematic relations is, unsurprisingly, found in Part 3 of Process and Reality, and particularly in connection with the idea of propositions. But even here, I would not say that Whitehead uses the term consistently in a technical way. Thus, what follows is partly reconstruction, partly interpretation. At the end of part 3, in the chapter, The Higher Phases of Experience, Whitehead casually suggests that there are 3 types or species of imagination. These are 1, conceptual imagination, 2, propositional imagination, and 3, conscious imagination. This is the only place where this distinction comes up, and as far as I can tell, it's the only occurrence of conceptual imagination, that phrase, with the meaning that it has here. Yet it's a helpful division, and I'll use it to anchor my discussion. Throughout part 3, when Whitehead does talk about imagination, he's most frequently talking about propositional imagination. Conscious imagination makes an appearance only at the end of part 3, and it is the lifting of propositional imagination into consciousness through contrast with what the actual world evidently is, without focus on truth or falsity. The phrase conceptual imagination, as I said, only makes this one appearance. Given the context of Whitehead's discussion, it seems to me that conceptual imagination is a synonym for conceptual reversion. In the phases of concrescence, as complexity is gained, conceptual imagination can develop into propositional imagination, which in turn can develop into conscious imagination. So thus, reversion is the basis of imagination. Reversion meaning that there is not simply the conceptual reproduction of physical feeling, but rather conceptual divergence from physical feeling that emphasizes a relevant possibility not directly derived from the physical feeling. But if not directly derived from where? Imaginatively, I would say. Though, of course, conceptual imagination does not work ex nihilo. It is subject to various categorical conditions, for example, of subjective unity and subjective harmony. And any imaginative decision must take into account the structure of possibility as constituted through God's primordial nature. And parenthetically, this primordial nature is felt by every concressing entity, though its structuring of possibility is not transparent to that entity in its processes of knowing. It's here in reversion, or conceptual imagination, that we have a germinal instance of the freedom or autonomy inherent in an actual entity. The feeling of alternative possibilities is conditioned, as noted above, and perhaps severely so. But the concressing actual entity is the ultimate ground determining which possibility is reverted to and how that possibility is felt or valuated. That is, imaginative vision, or perhaps better, imaginative impulse, is a basic activity of a self-causing or free entity. And with this germinal freedom comes novelty. As Whitehead writes, quote, "It is this category of conceptual reversion by which novelty enters the world," end quote. So here we can see that imagination is crucial to the open, creative character of the cosmos as seen by Whitehead. But conceptual imagination is a rudimentary form of imagination, a rather extreme extension of the term. So much so that Whitehead only refers to conceptual reversion as conceptual imagination once. Rather, when Whitehead discusses imagination and imaginative feeling, he's almost always operating at the level of propositions. Within this context of propositional feelings, an imaginative feeling is one where the nexus from which the logical subjects are derived is different from the nexus from which the predicative pattern is derived. A predicative pattern is an eternal object, a possibility, a potential determination of fact. There is thus in the imaginative feeling the union of a potential way of being and a collection of subjects, where the potentiality is imputed to and in contrast with subjects from which it was not derived, or at least not wholly derived. In other words, in an imaginative feeling, some actualities are in contrast with a particular possibility, that possibility being arrived at not through the strict consideration of the qualities of the actualities in question. There is, of course, a more technical discussion that may be had here, but I believe I've said enough to make it clear that what I have just described is exactly analogous to Whitehead's use of imaginative generalization in his description of speculative philosophy, save that imaginative generalization rises to the level of conscious imagination. According to this method of speculation, ideas derived from one limited area of experience are expanded and applied to other or broader areas of experience. A pattern or theory derived from one set of actualities is being applied to another with the goal of enriching experience through this contrast. Contrasts unify while preserving difference. This diversity brought into unity of contrast for the purpose of enriching experience is the essence of imagination. In this skeletal form of diversity brought into unity, you'll no doubt recognize a major motif of Whitehead's philosophy, extending all the way to the category of the ultimate. Imaginative feeling is one way that this pattern of unifying diversity while preserving difference occurs within actual occasions. And what imagination offers is the potentiality for richer, more intense contrast than would be available by sticking to a fixed set of facts and the potentials they actually exemplify. In other words, imagination introduces and helps promote novelty by creating contrasts within experience. This happens in two ways. First, the contrast, though imaginatively arrived at, helps illuminate facts about the indicated nexus. This is the way imagination functions in Whitehead's imaginative generalization. We bring something we've learned from biology and apply it more broadly in philosophy or psychology, for example, and that biological insight helps us understand the philosophical or psychological matter more richly. Such an act of reapplication is not easy. There are no rules for taking something from one domain and translating it into another that guarantees success. Hence, it is an effort of imagination and not an algorithm or procedure. Freedom is linked to imagination once again. Now, on to the second way in which imagination helps introduce novelty through the creation of contrasts. A contrast, imaginatively arrived at, functions as a lure for feeling. There's a proposition that calls attention to a possibility in its relevance to fact. That is, imaginative feeling proposes a potential fact, be it true or false. Where truth and falsity are important, and where there's effort towards the truth, we have the case of imagination supporting the pursuit of knowledge that I just described. But imaginative feelings may also illuminate possibilities that do not fit the facts. Such propositions are, strictly speaking, false. But truth or falsity isn't important here. Interest is. And possibilities that are not realized, possibilities that can only be conceived as distant, almost out of reach, can be incredibly interesting. Previously unseen possibilities can gain definition and clarity through imaginative feeling, and as such, they can lure actuality towards their realization. Novelty is on the horizon. For Whitehead, new forms are first realized conceptually and then are transmuted into physical experience. And that was partially a quote from Whitehead. Without conceptual reversion, new forms are never introduced, but forms are only reproduced from what has come before. There might be new instances of old forms, but never forms previously unrealized. No emergence, no creative evolution. Without propositional imagination, new forms never acquire the interest that comes with their potential realization being considered as a possibility for some definite actualities. This interest promotes depth and intensity of experience in the subject, entertaining the imaginative proposition through making possible a contrast between what is and what could be. It also provides a foothold for future actual occasions to also feel this possibility and perhaps work towards its full physical as opposed to conceptual realization. Serving as a conduit for novelty, imagination can shape and guide purpose. This newly directed energy, plus fortuitous circumstances and environmental conditions can then bring the new form into fact. Something new emerges into the physical world. And these last ideas, particularly the idea that imagination promotes the depth and intensity of experience through heightening the lure of contrast, bring us to the connection of imagination to art and aesthetic experience. For Whitehead, the generic aim of experience is expressed categorially as the aim at intensity and harmony. That is, the aim is at width and depth of experience, or, in the language of Adventures of Ideas, at massiveness and strength of experience. These ultimate ends of experience are aesthetic in the sense that the aim is at heightened feeling, full of variety and difference, and yet held together in the unity of contrast. Such complex feeling is a composition in the way that a work of art is also. For the many different feelings must be felt such that they enhance one another as far as is possible with the minimum of attenuation. Key to the heightening of intensity within experience is an expanded sense of possibility, or in Whitehead's words, the aims at intensity and harmony require realizing the maximum number of eternal objects so far as this can be done artfully, under the conditions of contrast. Thus, imagination is key in developing thick, rich aesthetic experience. For as we just discussed, imagination is the means through which new possibilities are introduced and enhanced in experience. We can draw from John Dewey's Art as Experience to complement this Whiteheadian account by looking at art and aesthetic experience as paragons of imagination in action. For Dewey, aesthetic experience, quote, is experience freed from the forces that impede and confuse its development as experience. Freed, that is, from factors that subordinate an experience as it is directly had to something beyond itself, end quote. This freely and integrally developing experience is what Whitehead describes as harmony. It is also an assertion of individuality, of the value of the immediate experience. An aesthetic experience is an experience, but development occurs within and of a context, an environment, and thus individuality created through the coordination and strengthening of the matters of experience is an embedded relational individuality. Such a relational consummatory experience is the attainment of beauty in Whitehead's sense of harmony and strength of experience. Aesthetic experience is the heightening and intensifying of the process of growing together that constitutes experience generally. The integral processes of experience are intensified and thickened through the felt contrasts between the actual and the possible introduced by imaginative functioning. Thus, imaginative functioning supports aesthetic experience. Works of art support aesthetic experience in the same way, for art objects also function imaginatively. In fact, an art object is an embodiment of imagination whose working provokes imaginative reenactment in others so as to engender aesthetic experience. Dewey writes that in a work of art, quote, the meanings imaginatively summoned, assembled, and integrated are embodied in material existence that here and now interacts with the self. The work of art is thus a challenge to the performance of a like act of evocation and organization through imagination on the part of the one who experiences it, end quote. This like act of evocation, when successful, enriches the immediate experience of the attentive perceiver by, another quote, clarifying and concentrating meanings contained in scattered and weakened ways in the material of other experiences, end quote. The clarifying and concentrating of meanings is an imaginative reconstruction of experience that, because it's imaginative, brings possibilities or meanings from the background of experience, often beneath awareness, into a more prominent position of enjoyment and potentially action. In art, past experiences are used to frame possibilities for present appreciation through physical mediation, be it lasting like a statue or ephemeral like a performance of dance or music. I've just got my concluding paragraphs now. Artistic expression requires an imaginative leap on the part of both the artist and the perceiver of art, because what a work of art expresses, the experienced contrast of the actual with imaginatively reconstructed possibilities, constitutes, a quote from Dewey, a unity of experience that can only be expressed as an experience, end quote. Yet these imaginative leaps are how we begin to redirect desire and purpose, how we can remake activity and thought. In Whiteheadian terms, we might say that works of art are repositories of potentiality. They are thick with symbolic meaning that can provoke imaginative feelings, both propositional and conscious, in those engaged with them. And from these imaginative feelings, there's an immediate enrichment of experience that simultaneously opens the future to new possibilities of experience and meaning and feeling. Opening the future generally involves a criticism of present conditions. This is because the vivid contrast between the actual and the possible in imaginative experience allows for a penetrating critique of the actual. As Dewey writes of the critical power of art, quote, "It is by a sense of possibilities opening before us that we become aware of the constrictions that hem us in and of burdens that oppress," end quote. Thus, activity and thought, desire and purpose may be lured in a new direction. As for the overall place of imagination in Whitehead's philosophy, we see that it's important throughout. An actual occasion is a compositional process, and the strength and liveliness of this composition, which Whitehead calls beauty, is only possible through the functioning of imagination. We see imagination present in the fundamental workings of Whitehead's systematic metaphysics in the category of conceptual reversion. And as we consider more and more complex actual entities, the sophistication of imaginative functioning grows as well, to the point where imagination can be expressed and embodied and thus shared in works of art so as to enrich both immediate and future experience. But from conceptual reversion to artistic expression, the basic function of imagination remains the engagement with alternative or unrealized possibilities so as to promote contrast with actuality and thus enrich immediate experience. As I hope to have convinced you, imagination is crucial for Whiteheadian process philosophy, whether the context be the becoming of actual occasions or the richness of artistic production and appreciation. Thank you.
Well, our next speaker is not as given originally in the program. John Gill, he couldn't make it. He felt sick and so on. So Jeremy Fackenthal was kind enough to present a paper. Now it's not on music as it would have been with John Gill, but now on aesthetics and film. He's giving a paper on ecofilms and process aesthetics. Just to introduce him to you who may not know him that well, he is the director of the Common Good International Film Festival, which is just going to start, as I hear, and an independent documentary filmmaker and videographer. Completing his PhD in philosophy of religion and theology from Claremont Graduate University, he began using his philosophical background beyond the academy to raise questions and craft narratives. In 2000, I skip a few things. In 2017, Jeremy shot and edited Spitting Fire, a short documentary on spoken word poetry as a means of personal formation of adolescents. His current ongoing project is a feature-length documentary on the life and work of the famous German philosopher Walter Benjamin and the possibility of art as a site for radical political action. All yours, Jeremy.
Process metaphysics holds that beauty arises from the way in which occasions of experience come together, involving both the mutual adaptation of the elements in a moment of experience and the introduction of novelty within this process. An ecological aesthetic, from this point of view, may include both one's experience of the natural world as beautiful, as well as one's experience of artistic depictions of the world, insofar as both include novelty within the experience. For Whitehead, art has a special role within civilization for conveying feelings about the world. Film can play a particularly important role in maintaining the freshness of civilization when depicting aspects of the world. The filmic image is never a spotless reproduction of this world, but the experience that it evokes is what gives it importance for civilization in a Whiteheadian aesthetic. Today, I wish to examine two films that exhibit what I call an ecological aesthetic. The first film is entitled "This Body is So Impermanent," and the second film, Anthropocene. Looking at these two films will help to demonstrate how art as experience can play a role in leading civilization toward new ideals. For Whitehead, the purpose of art is to exhibit both truth and beauty. Art is the purposeful adaptation of appearance to reality. Thus, any occasion or entity could be viewed as art so long as the real data of the earlier phases of concrescence are exhibited in the way an occasion grows together and reaches satisfaction. The end or goal of art, then, is both truth and beauty, confirmation of appearance to reality, but a confirmation that also produces novelty. Whitehead remarks that art in this sense is not the same as what we normally understand as art. It is not about producing art objects, but about forming an experience. Whitehead wants to push art toward a longer, more processual and gradual, purposeful confirmation of appearance to reality. What does this then mean for an ecological aesthetic, and how does film play a role in the production of novel contrasts? If beauty, truth, and goodness are three central components of civilization, then the experience of viewing a film can play a vital role in the advance of civilization in conveying feelings about the natural world in particular. In fact, Whitehead writes that, quote, "In its broadest sense, art is civilization, for civilization is nothing more than the unremitting aim at the major perfections of harmony," end quote. Our experience of films or other objects can introduce the new feelings or thoughts that keep the freshness of civilization alive, that keeps civilization from decaying as a result of outworn perfections, as Whitehead calls them, or the lack of contrast that produce something new. I suggest that film is a good example of these criteria from Whitehead's process metaphysics by producing the kinds of experiences in the viewer that prompt new ideas and a creative advance. Film, as I mentioned, could never be a replication of the occasions captured in moving images. Nevertheless, for Whitehead, our experience of the film is what matters, since it is our experience that produces the contrasts necessary for novelty. As Adrian J. Ivakiv writes, cinema not only mirrors and represents reality, but also shadows, extends, reshapes, and transforms it. In fact, from a process relational perspective, Ivakiv articulates that, quote, "Film is what a film does. And what it does is not just what occurs as one watches it, it is also what transpires as viewers mull it over afterwards, and as the film reverberates across the space between the film world and the real world, seeping into conversations and dreams, tinting the world and making it vibrate in particular ways," end quote. In this way, one's experience of the film as an art object is different than beauty, since art carries a purpose and thereby opens the space that continues the advance of civilization through new thought images and feelings, as Evocative notes and as Whitehead describes in his process metaphysics. The ecological aesthetic, then, is capable of so much more than a mere representation of the natural world. In fact, it helps to create the world through the elements of experience. In the remainder of this talk, I will examine the two films that I referred to at the beginning and that I refer to as eco-films. This Body is So Impermanent and Anthropocene. And I will articulate the ways in which each contributes to an ecological aesthetic from a process perspective. Renowned theater director Peter Sellers, present here at UCLA in Los Angeles, produced and directed the film This Body is So Impermanent as an artistic collaboration spanning 3 continents during the COVID-19 pandemic, begun in 2020. The film takes its inspiration from a 1st century Buddhist text, the Vimalakirti Sutra, and weaves together traditional Indian devotional singing, Chinese calligraphy, and improvisatory dance, all the while incorporating natural images of water and other elements displaying flux and the transitoriness of reality. This Body is So Impermanent demonstrates an ecological aesthetic understood from a process perspective on multiple levels, through the combination of bodily performances, through the natural imagery overlaid throughout the film, and through the use of the Buddhist text itself. I'll briefly describe each of these 3 aspects vis-a-vis the process aesthetic outlined in my opening. The bodily performances undertaken by each of the 3 artists in the film demonstrate an ecological aesthetic through their interconnections with one another and with the rest of the natural world, as well as through the ways in which their art evokes novel responses to a world in flux. Since the film was shot during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 3 artists were largely isolated and had to make use of recording capabilities in their homes or through local collaborators, depending on lockdown restrictions at the time. As a result, the artists did not meet in person and had no opportunity to rehearse with each other in a live setting. Nevertheless, the 3 did interact with each other and with the director, Peter Sellers, throughout the process. Connecting via video conferencing platforms enabled the artists to rehearse and show their performances to each other throughout the creative process. In discussion after the initial film screening, 2 of the artists, Ganavia, the vocalist, and Michael Schumacher, the dancer, described the creative and emotional connections made simply by watching each other's work. Listening to Ganavia singing, for instance, provided inspiration and creative insight for Michael's choreography. Likewise, watching unfinished footage of Wang Daling's calligraphy along the process shaped the artistic performances of Ganavia and Michael. Moreover, in a very process metaphysical sense, experiences of watching each other evoked feelings in the 3 performances that gave rise to new ideas and new ways in which the film would grow together. Despite lack of physical proximity, the interconnections among the artists were deep and meaningful, and they contribute to the ecological aesthetic by increasing the novelty of the experiences as they unfold. In addition, these interconnections are depicted in the film through the way in which footage was edited together. Images of Ganavia singing in her recording booth in Oregon are overlaid with images of Michael's improvisatory dance in his apartment in Amsterdam. The overlays underscore not only the interconnection of the artists in the process of making the film, but also the interconnection inherent among all components of our world, a notion that became particularly apparent during the pandemic. The film beautifully weaves these 3 artists together, creating a palpable, emotional, and creative connection that demonstrates the interrelationality of the ecological aesthetic from a process perspective. Beyond showing the interconnection of the three artists, the film also depicts the connection between humans and the rest of the natural world. Water imagery appears throughout the film, and the editor again makes use of overlays to place images of the three artists on top of moving water. The water in this context represents the flux or impermanence of life and of our current situations in the world. Turning to this most fundamental element as a source for beauty and truth, in Whitehead's sense of the term, deepens the ecological aesthetic by tying the reality of change and flux evoked in the artist's performance with the flux inherent in all parts of the natural world. This idea of flux, of process, is obviously fundamental to Whitehead's metaphysics and to an ecological aesthetic. The introduction of novelty or change, however subtle, permeates each concressing occasion. In a less metaphysical and more physical sense, we see changes occurring in all of the natural world, whether through the process of growing, aging, decaying, or through the shifts wrought by human activity upon the world, which I'll talk more about later. The text of the Vimalakirti Sutra itself serves as the underlying motivation and tempo of the film. The sutra, a first-century text and a foundational scripture of Zen Buddhism, chronicles the story of a sick bodhisattva who describes the impermanence and frailty of our human bodies, as well as the permanence and goodness of the body of the Buddha. Ganavya, the traditional Indian vocalist, sings selections of the sutra, while Wang Daoling, the calligrapher, writes out from memory the text of the sutra in traditional Chinese calligraphy. In this way, the text itself becomes a motivating character in the film, and the interplay of the text with the artists increases the film's novelty and evokes new feelings and thoughts through its representation. Themes of flux and impermanence within the text are wedded to the movements of the body, the vocal vibrations, and the brushstrokes of the calligrapher as a demonstration that we too are impermanent and in constant flux. Thus, the film creates an ecological aesthetic that emphasizes the interconnection of humans with the rest of the world, insofar as all occasions within the world eventually perish. And at the same time, it reminds us of the possibilities for healing within this world, insofar as one can look toward a wholeness of reality that both includes and excludes the creative beauty of the world in flux. Includes and exceeds the chaotic beauty of the world in flux. Anthropocene is the third film in a triad of feature documentaries from filmmakers Jennifer Bachwal, Nicolas de Ponsière, and Edward Bergnitsky. The goal of this film is to demonstrate the way in which humans have altered the planet during this geological age, commonly referred to as the Anthropocene, the age in which human activity has become the dominant influence on the environment and climate. Through interview voiceovers juxtaposed with eerily magnificent images of human transformation of nature, we see firsthand how notions of dominance over the natural world reshapes the planet in irreparable ways. The ecological aesthetic developed within the film emerges from the interplay of beauty and destruction and the way in which humans interact with such change. The images in the film Anthropocene are, I would say, hauntingly beautiful. Haunting because they show the way in which humans have changed the shape of our Earth through ecological harm, but also beautiful because of the aesthetic attention given to the shots and the pacing of the images. One particular example from the film comes to mind as an illustration of this strange juxtaposition. In a series of potash mines in the Ural Mountains, the pieces of equipment used to cut through the rock leave behind circles and waves of colors as the heat from the machine mixes with the natural colors of the rock to produce what might otherwise be considered as beautiful works of art. These images from the film use the interplay of light and dark to amplify the beauty of the colorful swirls within the mines. Of course, we realize that these wavy designs were created by human-made machines used to cut through large tunnels, for the extraction of potassium-based compound used in fertilizers, which can be harmful and even toxic to humans. The juxtaposition of the beauty with the destruction of the mountains and the use of these chemical compounds is startling, and it provides exactly the kind of occasion denoted in process thought as productive of novelty or new ideas and feelings. In this way, the juxtaposition becomes an important part of the ecological aesthetic within this ecofilm. Another way in which we see ecological aesthetic at work in Anthropocene is in the interaction between humans and the spaces or locations where fundamental human-made shifts have occurred. In some shots, we see workers moving next to massive pieces of machinery that are actively carving out the ground in the process of excavating some mineral or element. In other scenes, we witness humans who are directly and negatively impacted by these changed landscapes as they walk or jump over heaps of trash in vast landfills next to slums outside of Nairobi. Or we see the guards who confiscate ivory from poachers and then burn the ivory in huge plumes of flame and smoke in order to stop the illegal sale and continued trade of the animal product. The interactions between humans and these altered landscapes provides a similar juxtaposition to that of the beauty and destruction discussed a moment ago. And this juxtaposition is made even starker by the way the images are shot. The film uses wide angles or slow zooms out from a person to situate the individual within the larger landscape. The shots in the film show how small the humans are as compared to the destruction we have wrought. This contrast in size works in favor of the ecological aesthetic insofar as it raises novel questions and provokes novel thoughts about the role of humans within the world. It pushes us to new realizations as a civilization, which will hopefully move us not to maintaining these destructive ways, but toward aiming at the freshness of civilization, constantly in flux and fluctuating toward, we hope, better ways of living. These two films, This Body is So Impermanent and Anthropocene, demonstrate an ecological aesthetic from a process perspective in the way that they convey feelings about the natural world and the way that each film introduces new feelings or thoughts that keeps the freshness of civilization alive. Moreover, contrasts arise between the way the film is created and the way it is received by the viewer. The distinction between the two, in fact, opens up additional creative space for the viewer to interpret the film and reassess the purposeful adaptation of appearance to reality and the extent to which the film exhibits the notions of beauty, truth, and goodness. The creative component, from a process philosophical perspective, does not end with the creators of the film, but continues within and among the viewers. One might also add that collective viewing, screening a film in a theater full of people or within a certain community, may also open further potential for creative reception and interpretation of the film. The process notion of an ecological aesthetic, as derived from Whitehead's understanding of art and its role within civilization or as civilization, goes beyond the expression of just the beauty within nature. Rather, this ecological aesthetic, in fact, tells us something about the moments of experience that make up our lives, and it provides an orientation or a lure for the future occasions that will constitute what we become. This experience introduces the new feelings or thoughts that move civilization, that keeps civilization fresh and out of danger of decaying. Art can provide the contrast that produce something new. The two films discussed here serve as examples of how film can produce these kinds of contrasts. The contrasts that arise go beyond the contrasts in the film mentioned in my analysis above, but also include contrasts within the individuals watching the films. One could ask, how does watching these films raise questions among humans about flux and impermanence, or about human interactions with the rest of the natural world? The thoughts and feelings produced within the viewer through these and other questions then serve to provoke new contrasts, new insights, new ideas that keep us from reaching stasis or decaying, but rather that move us toward providing novelty and ensuring that occasions include the contrasts necessary for a creative advance. Thank you.
What a pity that we couldn't watch the movies as well. It would be beyond the time frame here. So our last speaker is Catherine Carver. She is an interdisciplinary scholar focused on the intersection of process metaphysics, post-secularity, psychology, literature, and cultural effect. I'll not summarize the rest, just tell you a nice story. We met the first time at the second summer school in the European Society in Mülheim in the Ruhr Center, and she came from Harvard without her suitcase, which happened to some people as well, so she had to be helped to take part properly. Kathleen, it's all yours.
Here are my resolutions for the next 3 months, the next lap of the year. To have none, to not be tied, to be free and kindly with myself, not goading it to parties, to sit rather privately reading in the studio, to make a good job of the waves, to stop irritation by the assurance that nothing is worth irritation, sometimes to read, sometimes not to read. To go out, yes, but stay at home in spite of being asked. And as for clothes, to buy good ones. These resolutions, or deliberate lack thereof, are of course not mine, but instead come from the diaries of Virginia Woolf, this specifically from the year of 1931. Commentary that, like Whitehead's magnum opus, are fast approaching their centennial. I find myself drawn to the comment at the end. As for clothes, to buy good ones. And so it has indeed, perhaps subconsciously, as I have lived with Virginia for so many years in my own research, I likely don't need to read her words verbatim any longer for her to sneak up in my psyche. But it has indeed been, in my view, for some months now, to find better clothes. Because in the work I do, academically, professionally, personally, whether I identify myself as a scholar of philosophy, theology, psychology, literature, whatever qualifications fit the context and call me to call myself by, whatever I am doing with a unifying goal in mind, and that is to broaden access to resources and to offer welcome into conversations that help others better make meaning of and build relationship between their experiences. In this endeavor, process studies paved a way for me very early in my career, for me to make sense of multitudinous professional identities along providing ample framework and fodder for accomplishing my interdisciplinary goals of fostering creative contrasts in the quest for ever-increasing value in relation, while communicating the breadth and width of process thought, both within and out with specialized settings, has long had a tradition in the field of posing its share of challenges. It has always been an almost exciting challenge, an element of fun buried in the pursuit of understanding and wider applicability. But then the world started to change. Expertise grew to be increasingly met with suspicion, jargon with disdain, religious affiliations and connections growing ever more divisive and polarized. And then a pandemic devastated our understanding of what relationship looked like, upended our accepted rituals for connection, interrupted every sense of lived process we had collectively come to depend upon. And so the stage was actually very suitably set for the kind of work I've always aimed at, fostering connection, introducing language and models for meaning making. But what changed was that the need had deepened and increased exponentially.
There was less of a thrill in the challenge to overcome barriers to understanding, and more of a pressing need to engage people mourning a globalized human loss. The nitpicky metaphysical particulars be damned. Human connection had been, and too often remains still, severed en masse. What quick adaptations could be made to the message of process that I'd employed, and fairly successfully, for so many years, that could make others, or could help make others make sense of their circumstances, that would still preserve the meaning and intent of the philosophy, but sidestep those barriers to engagement, despite that long-standing tradition of trying to share process outside of academic settings. The particulars of what emerged as a streamlined, more broadly applicable approach are likely not wholly surprising, and of course it requires generalizations be taken. Nevertheless, most frequently, the sticking points for wider receptivity were plain and consistent. It's the jargon, and it's the theology. Jargon makes people feel excluded, the opposite of the relationship aimed for repair. God talk often does the same, especially in increasingly sectarian societies, and even in largely secular societies. In a time of already raised tensions and anxieties, it kind of just makes people a little twitchy. So I had identified how actual engagement in vivo had shifted its demands, and I worked to meet that need, but I remained a researcher, and I wanted to formalize what I was seeing and how I was responding in a way that interpreted the processive model faithfully, but effectively. And it was here that I remembered Virginia Woolf and her wisdom on clothing. Should you need new ones, buy good ones. And my approach to process thought and lived practice needed a new outfit, specifically a good one. Here, Virginia offered me insight and direction once more. My research has often revolved around how to engage non-traditionally religious cultural artifacts and experiences as defensively and demonstrably religious. And I've almost exclusively utilized process thought in order to facilitate those arguments. One such being for the religious significance of the works of Virginia Woolf, supposedly one of those notoriously godless modernists. And it was through the same lens that I was able to iterate a renewed approach to process, one that is deeply and unapologetically post-secular. As such, the remainder of my time will be dedicated to outlining that approach and touching briefly on what I mean by a dedicatedly process post-secularity. Because post-secularism is a lot like every other post-ism. It's anything but simple, consistent, agreed upon, or in any sense cut and dried. But I make the proposition in earnest, because from both theory and application, on the occasion of this encouraging anniversary we've gathered here to mark, which can serve also as a generational inflection point for our field and our world, I believe that process studies would benefit exceedingly by adopting a post-secular stance more frequently, more formally, and more flexibly. So that's the thesis. And I want to dive into the conversation surrounding it with what might appear at first glance to be an idle piece of trivia, but I assure you it is useful in organizing the propositions to follow. It is relevant given the panel that we are on, and most importantly, it's very effective as a tool for the post-secularization of the conversation, particularly given the generally accepted status of art, intentionally theological or otherwise, as being worthy of religious consideration. It's a very convenient fit. I began my university education as a visual arts student. I'd prepared a portfolio, I'd secured a scholarship, and I was deeply moved and committed to the process and significance of creativity in the world before I ever heard the name Alfred North Whitehead. And so the idea of creating as a rule on a daily basis as a condition of my education and its funding seemed like a pretty good match. I didn't actually remain in the visual arts in terms of a degree or career trajectory, as is probably evident here and now, but I am grateful for the perspective and the training and practice in that field provided me. Thus, with that in mind, one of the most formative experiences as an artist that I can recall was the first time I stretched my own canvas. There are three main steps, conveniently matched to Whitehead's three stages of education. You start with the frame. You get out your hammer, your wood glue, you determine the parameters, you select the dimensions, You define the scope, and you allow it to solidify in the foundation for everything that follows. From there, you cut a length of raw canvas that exceeds the dimensions of your frame. You wrap it around the wood, and you begin to secure it, usually with a staple gun. It's a very violent process. Then you pull it taut from every angle, stretching it as far as it will go, testing the warp and the weft of the material, circling the perimeter again and again. You find the tightest possible way in which to bring together the opposite sides of your frame. Finally, now, you're ready to prime the canvas itself. This is typically accomplished with a binder known as gesso, a paint mixture not entirely divorced from acrylic, but heavier, stronger. It serves as both the means of sealing the porous canvas and, in doing so, preparing the canvas for use as a base for painting, for creation. In the application of the metaphor, I take process thought as the frame, the conversation perimeter. I take my conversation partner as the raw canvas for stretching, and normally I have chosen a defined entity. I've worked with the literary catalog of Woolf. I've worked with the popularization of ethical inquiry on the network television show The Good Place. I've even worked with the varied symbology within the discography of Ronnie James Dio. I work in popular culture because it's arguably the most predictable and accessible context for broad meaning making. It's not a stretch conceptually then, merely in scope, that I ask you to engage my canvas-styled conversation partner here as simply non-specialized interlocutors. Any of them, all of them. It can be a very large canvas. I submit that we've reached Whitehead's educational stage of generalization here, through which we must share in community and relation in order to begin the cycle anew with romance. To allow the remaining wonder of philosophy to be the start and end of our journey, as well as the hallmark of how it begins anew. Finally, then, atop the canvas attached to our frame, we seal the gaps with our gesso, and here, that gesso is going to be post-secularism of a particular stripe. Our new good close for both this lap of the next year and maybe the next lap of our collective work at large. Now, I have been asked by specialists and non-specialists alike, what even is post-secularism? As alluded previously, it's not an easy definition, and it will require a bit of history to responsibly lend it context, but I will do my best to make it as painless as possible. Much like the actual chemical components that are involved in the creation of gesso and have been across the centuries, post-secularism has endured and continues to enjoy a nebulous, often contested identity. The project at hand is, again, not to wade through the history, signposts, and the fast-evolving and sometimes contentious dialogue surrounding the concept, but the project at hand is invested in binding the warp and weft of the non-specialized conversational canvas to the Whiteheadian frame in a way that solidifies the foundation of the evidence to be laid in service of the thesis argument. That being the ways in which parallels can be drawn between our given dialogue partners within the overarching context of the post-secular guiding the lines can and does illuminate new and evocative inroads for scholarly and, more crucially, to the needs of the moment for practical application. The arguments of the secular and post-secular stretch back far, depending on how one defines either concept and which disciplinary commitments guide their narrative. For the purpose of my argument here, the focus will be narrow and relatively modern. The work of Charles Taylor in the early to mid-2000s, most notably in his opus A Secular Age, moves quickly to juxtapose a previous age of enchantment, largely in the shape of religiosity, against a present day which is much less concerned, or else predictably concerned, with such things, characterizing the modern secular age as one of delineation. Quote, "The enchanted world was one in which these forces could cross a porous boundary and shape our lives, psychic and physical. One of the big differences between us and them is that we live with a much firmer sense of the boundary between self and other. We are buffered selves. We have changed." These starting points for an observational stance on the trajectory of modern secularization eventually contributed to spark the first articulations of the modern post-secular, one of the earliest and certainly most prestigious articulations of which came from sociologist Jürgen Habermas, who, only 1 year after the publication of Taylor's book, aimed at complicating the idea of the secular into the post-secular, which he submitted better reflected Western reality. His revision of the secularization hypothesis relates less to its substance and more to the predictions concerning the future role of religion. His description, therefore, of the post-secular refers to what he terms a, quote, change in consciousness, which he attributes to three coinciding phenomena: a concession of the remaining influence of religion, even in a secularizing society, often and predominantly exhibited in circumstances of global warfare and violence; the increasing political clout of religion, forcing party lines and affiliations to mediate in the presence of the theological against the secular, even in traditional and sometimes mandated realms of separation; and an increase in globalization, wherein more members of traditionally religious or enchantment-oriented cultures began to build lives and enter community dialogue with the secular West. Collectively, then, Habermas asserts that the secular is insufficient because, quote, in Western societies, religion maintains a public influence and relevance, while the secularistic certainty that religion will disappear worldwide in the course of modernization is losing ground. Here it is the work of political theorist William Connolly that emerges as one of the main voices to ease the way away from the religious secular polarities and inspires and guides the use of the post-secular that I am specifically endorsing for adoption and process contexts, in part because Connolly is openly relevant and situated toward understanding post-secularity in the context of transition, not just the idea and concept from a scholarly or referential standpoint, but also in what it is aiming to capture, a reality that is transitory, interconnected, and thereby ever-changing and always creating. Conveniently, Connolly already has overlap with many process-oriented concepts and thinkers, and has written extensively and espoused enthusiastically support for an immanent state of being in which, quote, the world is in a constant state of creatively becoming, and the universe at large is, quote, endlessly creative. His approach to post-secularism in this vein emerged out of a stance against secularism, stated clearly in his 1999 volume, Why I Am Not a Secularist, aptly titled. Here, he, pre-Taylorian secularism, began to articulate an idea of post-secularism pointing toward his understanding of such a perspective as encouraging the exploration of what the intersection of the religious and secular may, quote, indicate more generally about the layered intricacy of thinking and judgment, and about the positive role they often play in life. Drawing greater parallels between Connolly's interpretation of post-secularism and process thought, Connolly himself characterizes his work as, quote, an attempt to engage tensions, as well as to advance considerations worthy of the attention of others, in search of a means of, quote, reworking the secular problematic by exploring layered conceptions of thinking, ethos, and public life appropriate to a timely vision of multi-dimensional pluralism. Here, speaking of tensions and later dimensionality, he speaks to process relationality. Further, Connolly speaks repeatedly of the, quote, intensity of the tension between the classically religious and secular, aiming at the need and the now to cultivate a public ethos of engagement in which, quote, a wider variety of perspectives than heretofore acknowledge, inform, and estrain one another. By honoring what he calls a plurality of being, Connolly seeks to, quote, renegotiate relations between interdependent partisans in a world in which no constituency's claim to embody the authoritative source of public reason is sanctified. In this way, the elements of a post-secular universe are placed within a constant state of negotiation, relying as a matter of course upon creative interplay and relational contrast to build a reality that fits the character of the construct. This in turn leads to a second voice that lays root for this project's post-secularism. That is theologian John Caputo, specifically as he speaks on the nature of religion and post-secularism in his landmark text on religion. Perhaps most orientatingly, Caputo characterizes the post-secular as a religion without religion, while also clearly stating that, quote, one of the most important things the word postmodern would have meant had it not been ground senseless by overuse would quite simply be post-secular. Caputo not only makes it clear that the post-secular would be much more accepted as a descriptor and lens of understanding and critique if it held the same conversational ubiquity as postmodern, But notably, he underscores, quote, "The post and post-secular should not be understood to mean over and done with, but rather having passed through modernity, in conjunction with, in relation to, and within temporal connection with the past of secularism and of modernity." For Caputo, this post-secular frame of mind has arisen as a result of an iteration process wherein criticizing the critique ends up in a post-critical position, one that is interestingly like, but importantly unlike, the pre-critical position. One that is The result is the unearthing of a certain analogy between the pre-critical and the post-critical, and newly open lines of communication between them. He's more concerned with the lines of communication and the places for creative dialogue than with the terms attributed. Similarly, where Caputo speaks to the post-critical echoing the pre-critical and the postmodern repeating the pre-modern in a new way, Whitehead's emphasis on the significance of the past upon every drop of experience understood colloquially as the present likewise shines through. Believe it or not, that was the abbreviated overview of what post-secularity means. And it's near axiomatic, at least in given applications and iterations, and its overlap with process thought. And if we can move further to actively engage and affirm this relationship, it by default affirms in kind and invites connections to points of meaning, experience, and connection for a vastly increased audience of partners in creativity. In Connolly's terms, every comprehensive view is a faith. If we apply this framework with intentionality, we can overcome the tendency to think about engaging cultural texts and events like Scripture or as something sacred, mimicking Lectio Divina in the interest of justifying the religious and spiritual correlations. Instead, the correlations are not merely inevitable, but lie beyond the boundaries of church and denomination. Within a broader understanding of the religious and spiritual, then, as process invites and post-secularity can be used to solidify, the sources of meaning-making engaged beyond religious texts and outside of the academy no longer exist merely as things to be engaged like established spiritual rituals or typicalized religious texts. It is simply spiritual and religious. It has sacred meaning within the modern world in its own divine right of ultimate beauty. Nothing is required to be made like or shaped to fit a pre-existing mold that has been preordained to have meaning in order for a thing to have sacred weight and meaning in itself. The meaning is a given when the frame and the terms are set appropriately and reflectively of the reality being engaged. And in opening this door, we open the door to a vast realm of possibility embodied within a new audience for engagement and growth within our field. Such new good clothes for our work, in Woolf's estimation, echo another of her observations. Quote, "Life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from beginning of consciousness to the end." I concur with her sentiment, not least because the approach herein suggested would allow me to engage it as a sacred as a rule, but I firmly believe that the adoption of post-secularity as a light source for that luminous halo will lend new and consistently renewing life to the field of process studies across the years ahead.
Well, thank you again. I'm trying to put 3 short questions and maybe get short answers as well before we open the panel. Alex, I wonder whether you sort of notice imagination doesn't come ex nihilo, whether you can actually keep that statement. I mean, all the distinctions you introduced, obviously they are interrelated, that's true. But isn't at the core something which just happens? As you, I think I told you about it, Aristotle in the Generazione et Corruptione said, if you want to understand something new happening, you will realize it's something which you can't found anywhere else, so it comes out of nothing. What do you say?
Thank you, Helmut. I mean, I think that's something coming from nothing. I mean, oldest and perhaps deepest yet unanswerable philosophical question. But imagination, I mean, I think it depends. In Whitehead, I don't know, my instinct here is to say, well, if we're, we want to dig down a little bit, find the roots here, conceptual reversion. If you're going to stick with the category of conceptual reversion, yes, ex nihilo. But as we heard, Whitehead abolishes it in a, certain sort of way. And, that abolishing is because you have a feeling of the primordial nature of God, which is the structuring of possibility. So if you want to abolish conceptual reversion, well, it's not from nothing. It's, because you have some feeling of possibility writ large. So no. But if you don't want to talk about possibility writ large, then sure, because in a way, the action of, I guess I'm inclined to agree with you, because the action of imagination, it's like, yes, it's coming, you have felt, even if you want to say you felt the primordial nature of God. Well, I mean, what's your, so you're, what, red rather than, like, why is it, it just happens. Yeah.
I mean, that's the point. Process and Reality 317. Whitehead is criticizing Aristotle for his idea of substance, but he says he has the best analysis of generation and disappearing. And he's referring to this little book by Aristotle, which had been edited in 1924 by his Oxford colleague, H.H. Joachim. But I mean, that's a longer point of discussion. Okay, thank you. A small question simply. Would you be able, Jeremy, to define the special function of film vis-à-vis all other forms of art in a nutshell, if you like?
Good luck. Perhaps. I think, to me, what sets film apart is that it is a collection or an amalgamation of images, and so it's the construction of the film itself is a process, and it can be uncertain or uncontrolled in a sense, whereas as other forms perhaps can be controlled by the artist in certain ways. I suppose in all forms of art there is that there is definitely flux and, input of creative material from outside. Yeah, but I think, the process of making a film is inherently open to the conditions of what is before you that in a sense are beyond control.
I think you guessed probably that I wanted to provoke you, of course. I mean, that sometimes helps, not in a bad way, but sort of trying to get something out. Yeah, then, Kathleen, there was a big discussion in Germany on secularization. Hans Blumenberg had written a major book on the legitimacy of modernity, criticizing the old concept of secularization as a loss of religious impact and so on. Is that a focus you see in what is so-called post-secularism, or would you define that differently? I heard certain similarities there, but...
I think Habermas in particular was very clear about there being a loss, right?
Yeah.
And so I specifically don't focus on him because I'm not focused on the loss. And I don't think that is as appropriate to be brought into conversation with process, because I don't think that is as fruitful or generative in conversation with Whitehead, which is part of the reason I lean more on Caputo and specifically on Connolly. One, because Connolly is so, whether he will define himself as such, he is very steeped in process thought. And he naturally fits that bill a lot more cleanly. I think the focus on loss and the focus on dichotomies and binaries is problematic to be in conversation and to be widely used with Whitehead.
That's why I was mentioning Hans Blumenberg. He would really, and it's a terrific work, because I think it has been translated for a long time, legitimacy of modernity would just fit in there as well, and he has lots of extra philosophical material in it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I touched on that briefly in the original thing that was adapted from, but I had to cut a lot.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions. I see Sinan. Let's go to Farhad, and then I'll go to Sinan.
I just wanted to pick up on Helmut's question to Alex. I've reflected on similar things that you presented, Alex, in your presentation, the conscious imagination and all of that. And it seems to me that moment of suspended judgment between affirmation or negation of input is the nihilo, the empty space, the interstitial space from which the novelty comes. It's built right into his system of what consciousness is and the freedom that it has. What do you think of that?
I hadn't, like I said, I just kind of started doing this exploration. Hadn't thought of that. Sounds great. I'm going to write, yeah. I don't really have too much to add. That sounds, something to, definitely for me to think more about. Thank you.
I have a small chapter on that.
Oh yeah, please.
Helmut wanted to provoke Jeremy with this question. I actually have a question to Jeremy about provocation. And it's about the aesthetic, or the quality of the aesthetic experience, and especially when you talk about art in the context of ecology, we have this big problem that we're often facing terrible images, really that provoke emotions, which are really a lot of grief, disgust, despair. And at the same time, arts are known to, wrap you in a cloud of feeling comfort. And somehow, especially you talked about Edward Burtynsky's work, it is almost too comforting to make you realize that this is something really problematic we're looking at. And so my question is really, how do you see the role of arts in terms of provoking an action, but also at the same time being its own cause? Because of course no artist wants to be an illustrator of the ecological movement. They want to be artists. Mm-hmm. That's my question.
Wow. I think films or works of art that leave the questions open, so not necessarily providing a clear call to action at the end, but creating those dislocations that make us feel uncomfortable is necessary. And you may be right that Burtynsky's work is too aesthetically pleasing or wraps you in that sort of sense of beauty and wonder without provoking the disgust at how that sort of strangely beautiful object was actually created. I think of some films that we have included in the film festival both this year and in the past that sort of both talk about ecological destruction as well as solutions, but then even problematize the solutions by saying that this may not be scalable, it may not be enough in enough time, and they don't provide the solid answers. And I think the films that end with questions are the best at provoking conversation and then at perhaps provoking something that emerges further from that conversation. So, hope that gets at it in a sense.
Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, Caitlin. Well, this concludes our second day. We hope you'll all return tomorrow. We're going to start at 9 a.m. sharp. Coffee from 8:30 to 9, so feel free to show up for that. We ended yesterday with, I think, an interesting and apt quote, sort of a riddle for you to think about for dinner. So here's another one for you. It's one of my favorite quotes of Whitehead. It comes from Essays in Science and Philosophy, some of his later essays. And it's particularly, Helmut, I think, something that you'll enjoy. He speculates, where should philosophy begin? He says, well, we could start with mathematics, we could start with philosophy, but here's his recommendation. He says, my own belief is that at present the most fruitful, because the most neglected starting point, is that section of value theory which we term aesthetics. Our enjoyment of the values of human art or of natural beauty, our horror at the obvious vulgarities and defacements which force themselves upon us, all these modes of experience are sufficiently abstracted to be relatively obvious. And here's my favorite line. And yet, evidently, they disclose the very meaning of things. Enjoy your dinner.
So with your question to Jeremy, do you think what you asked about specific function of film against, do you think different arts have specific functions, or are they more differentiated by their media, like what they're?
I think they don't have. But I mean, one can always be sort of too revealing. You know that the question already indicates this only can be the answer. I asked Catherine Keller if she would come for dinner with me, and she was asking if other people were interested. To have time plus want to.
I should have time, yeah.
And you want as well? Okay.
I have to meet my friend Kevin,
I think you're
where
busy. No, I don't know yet.
Friends, if you've lost a key, somebody left a key on one of the pews.
Yeah.
A key to someone's heart, I have it. It's right here.
In what company?
Yeah. Wow. No, I think, yeah.
I was too naughty, so you do it.
Thank you. I actually found the microphone kind of disconcerting. Like this sound was too.
Like the reverb.
Yes.
Yeah. Enjoy all your talks, really.
Oh, thank you. So, do you want to give me yours? Should I give you my email, or do you want to give me yours? Which both?
So all three of us met in Dusseldorf.
Yeah. Anywhere here? I don't want to. Okay.
Cool.
With Helmut.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just Dusseldorf.
Right.
It's Dusseldorf again. It's
Yeah.
fine. We're revisiting the past.
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar with Ronnie Desmond's book. I have a chapter in that book, and I go tracking into this.
Okay, great.
So
Yeah, I mean,
tracking everything.
Oh, great. No, that's wonderful. Because I also had to. I was a little afraid getting this ready because it's just. It ended up being very, compressed. Like it was. I know, 20 minutes. It was just like, I hope people can follow, because it's just like, because the longer version has a little more breathing room, but there's no time for it.
Enjoy reading that.
Yeah.
We have a nice lecture for tonight. It's just 6 minutes.
I mean, you encounter with other
places he talks
but it was Connolly's very
space
obsessive commitment to
And it's not literally
that
space.
made
Right.
it like, okay,
Sometimes it is literally space.
this has got
Yeah.
traction.
The
So I was encouraged by it.
They're refusing to judge.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Holding back from that. If that's the very Taoistic thing that we're That's as much nothing as we're
May I just get your name as well, please? No, it turns around every time. Tian. From Iran?
Iran originally.
Iran.
I see.
You teach as well? Or?
Yeah, I teach the sort of humanities core requirements. And the science of clarity.
But then we have to, you gave him the details. I want to have a look into that book as well.
I'd like to send you.
Can you read this? Okay, just making sure. I mean, it just might, yeah, HAITOS@gmail. Yep. Okay.
He forwarded it. I send my thanks to you then. So then we have the
Okay.
I was not aware of this collection that you've written. It's not done enough, I think. It's so evocative, so the power.